Hi everyone, welcome back to Pine Hat. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we're going to talk about someone who had everything and lost it all. Not because the world was cruel to him, although it was. Not because he wasn't smart enough, because he was maybe the smartest person in his universe. Number Stanford Pines lost everything because he never learned the one lesson that mattered more than any equation or discovery or interdimensional breakthrough. He never learned that being brilliant means nothing if you're alone. This is the story of Ford Pines. The full story. From the kid with 6 fingers who just wanted someone to think he was special, to the old man who watched his brother erase his own mind to fix a mistake that started decades ago. And if you really sit with this story, if you really follow it from beginning to end, you start to realize something uncomfortable. Ford's tragedy isn't that bad things happened to him. It's that almost every bad thing that happened to him started with a choice he made because he was afraid. If you're here to fall asleep, settle in. This one's going to take a while. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning, to a beach covered in broken glass, and 2 brothers who thought they'd never be apart. If you're here to actually think about it, even better. Because Ford's story has a lot to say about what happens when you let your pain become your personality. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve these videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. There's a beach in New Jersey called Glass Shard Beach. And if you've ever been to the parts of the Jersey Shore that tourists don't visit, you know the kind of place I'm talking about. It's not the boardwalks and the cotton candy. It's the kind of town where the sand has bits of broken glass in it, where the storefronts are half shuttered, where people don't really leave because they can't afford to, and they don't really stay because they want to. Glass Shard Beach is the kind of place that tells you, from the moment you're born, that you're not going anywhere special. And that's where Stanford Philbrick Pines came into the world. 15 minutes before his twin brother, Stanley. 15 minutes that would end up meaning almost nothing and almost everything, depending on how you look at it. Because Ford came first, but Stan was the one who spent his whole life trying to catch up. And Ford was the one who spent his whole life trying to pull away. But we'll get to that. The first thing you need to understand about Ford is the hands. 6 fingers on each hand. 12 fingers total. Hexadactyly, it's called. And it's a real condition. It happens in roughly 1 out of every 500 to 1,000 births, depending on the population, though having it on both hands is considerably rarer. For Ford, it wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was the thing that defined his entire childhood. Kids are cruel. You know this. Everyone knows this. But there's a specific kind of cruelty that children reserve for anyone who looks different. Anyone whose body doesn't match the template they've been taught to expect. Ford's extra fingers made him a target from the very beginning. There was a bully, a kid named Krampelter, who made Ford's life miserable. And in a lot of ways, Krampelter is the least interesting villain in Ford's story, because he's just the first in a long line of people and entities who would look at Ford and see something to exploit. But Krampelter matters because he established the pattern. Ford was different. Ford was vulnerable. And Ford needed someone to stand between him and the world. That someone was Stanley. Here's the thing about Stan and Ford as kids. They were inseparable. Completely, utterly inseparable. And this is important because everything that happens later, all the decades of silence and resentment and guilt, only hurts as much as it does because of how close they were at the start. Stan would fight Krampelter for Ford. Stan would take hits for his brother without thinking twice. And Stan didn't care about the 6 fingers. He thought they were cool. He invented a handshake that used all 6, a high 6 instead of a high 5. And that small gesture tells you everything you need to know about Stanley Pines as a person. Where the rest of the world saw something wrong with Ford, Stan saw something that made their bond unique. Something that belonged to them. Their father, Philbrick Pines, was a different story. Philbrick ran a pawn shop, and he had the personality to match. Tough. Practical. Not particularly warm. The kind of father who enrolled both his sons in boxing lessons not because he wanted them to have fun, but because he wanted them to survive. Their mother was warmer, but Philbrick set the tone of the household, and that tone was simple. You earn your keep. You prove your worth. You don't get anything for free. And this matters because it planted something in Ford very early. The idea that love is conditional, that you have to be exceptional to deserve attention, to deserve care. Ford's intelligence was the thing that made his parents proud. It was the thing that made teachers notice him. It was the thing that made the world say, okay, maybe the hands are weird, but look at that brain. And so Ford learned, without anyone ever saying it directly, that his value as a person was tied to his value as a mind. Stan, meanwhile, learned the opposite lesson. Stan wasn't the smart one. Stan was the funny one, the scrappy one, the one who could talk his way into or out of anything. But in the Pines household, in that specific economy of love and attention, funny and scrappy didn't have the same currency as brilliant. Stan knew, even as a kid, that Ford was the golden child, and he loved his brother anyway. That's what makes Stanley Pines one of the most heartbreaking characters in animation. But this isn't Stan's story. Not tonight. Tonight is about Ford. And to understand Ford, you need to understand what it feels like to be the gifted child. There's a concept in psychology sometimes called gifted child syndrome, and it describes what happens when a child's identity becomes entirely wrapped up in their intelligence. When being smart isn't just something you are, it's everything you are. Your parents love you because you're smart. Your teachers value you because you're smart. The world makes space for you because you're smart. And so you start to believe, deep down in the part of yourself that you never examine, that if you ever stop being the smartest person in the room, you'll stop being worthy of love. Ford had this. He had it badly. And the six fingers made it worse because they gave him this constant, visible reminder that he was different. Not different in the way that gets celebrated, different in the way that gets whispered about. And so intelligence became his armor. If the world was going to stare at his hands, fine. He'd give them something else to stare at. He'd be so brilliant, so accomplished, so undeniably exceptional that the hands wouldn't matter anymore. This is the seed of everything. Every mistake Ford would make for the next 40 years grew from this single root. The need to be special, the terror of being ordinary, the belief that if he could just understand enough, discover enough, prove enough, the world would finally accept him fully, hands and all. And for a while, it seemed like it was working. There was a boat. You probably know about the boat. The Stano War. The kids found it on the beach, a wrecked old vessel half buried in the sand, and they decided they were going to fix it up and sail around the world. Just the two of them. No Glass Shard Beach, no Krampelter, no Philbrick and his pawn shop. Just the open ocean and whatever they found out there. The Stano War was more than a boat. It was a promise. It was two brothers saying to each other, "We don't need anyone else. We don't need the world to accept us. We just need each other and a horizon." And they worked on it together, weekends and summers, patching holes and dreaming out loud about all the places they'd go. It was the purest thing in either of their lives. I want you to hold that image in your mind for a moment. Two kids on a beach, a boat that barely floats, the sound of the waves and the seagulls and the distant noise of a town that doesn't care about them. Because this image is going to come back. At the very end of everything, after the demons and the dimensions and the destroyed minds, this image is what survives. The boat, the beach, the brothers. Every tragedy has an Eden. A before time when things were whole, when the characters were innocent, or as close to innocent as they'd ever get. The Stano War is Ford's Eden. It's the place his mind returns to when everything else fails. It's the reference point against which all future loss is measured. And the fact that Ford eventually gets back to it, that the show gives him the boat again, is the difference between a Greek tragedy and a fairy tale. In Greek tragedy, Eden is lost forever. In a fairy tale, you can go home. Gravity Falls, somehow, manages to be both. But here's what was already starting to happen, even then. Ford was getting smarter. Ford was getting noticed. And the world outside Glass Shard Beach was starting to reach for him, to pull him toward a future that didn't include a broken boat and a twin brother who couldn't keep up. Ford didn't want to leave Stan, not consciously, but the same intelligence that made him special was also making him see things Stan couldn't. He was starting to realize that Glass Shard Beach was small, that the ocean was just water, and that the real mysteries were somewhere else entirely. And then came the science fair. This is the moment everything breaks. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, irreversible way that real damage happens. Ford built a perpetual motion machine for his high school science fair project. Now, a perpetual motion machine is theoretically impossible. It violates the laws of thermodynamics. But Ford, being Ford, built something close enough to impress. Close enough that representatives from West Coast Tech, the most prestigious technical college in the country at the time, came to Glass Shard Beach specifically to see it. Think about that for a second. This kid from this nothing town, with his weird hands and his secondhand clothes, had built something so remarkable that the best school in the country sent people to look at it. Ford was going to get out. He was going to matter. Everything his parents had wanted for him, everything he'd wanted for himself, was sitting on a folding table in a high school gymnasium. And then Stan broke it. Now, let's be precise about what happened, because this is one of those moments that the show treats with incredible nuance. Stan didn't sabotage the machine out of malice. He didn't destroy it because he wanted to hurt Ford. What happened was this. Stan found out that Ford was planning to leave Glass Shard Beach, to go to West Coast Tech, to pursue a life that didn't include the Stano War, or the beach, or Stanley. And Stan panicked. He went to Ford's lab the night before the science fair, upset and desperate, and in his agitation, he accidentally damaged the machine. He threw a bag of toffee peanuts. He hit the table. It was clumsy and emotional and completely unintentional. But the machine didn't work the next morning, and the West Coast Tech representatives, seeing a non-functional perpetual motion machine, walked away without a second glance. And here's where Ford's tragedy really begins. Because Ford had a choice in that moment. He could have listened to his brother. He could have looked at Stan's face and seen the fear and the guilt and the love underneath the accident. He could have said, "Okay, the machine is broken, but we're not broken. We'll figure something out." He didn't. Ford chose to believe that Stan had done it on purpose. He chose to believe that his brother, the person who had defended him against every bully, who had invented a handshake just for his weird hands, who had spent years building a boat with him on a broken beach, had deliberately destroyed his future. And the reason Ford believed this is the same reason he would later believe Bill Cipher, and the same reason he would spend 30 years alone in other dimensions. Ford couldn't imagine that someone would love him enough to be afraid of losing him. He could only imagine that someone would be jealous enough to tear him down. This is the core of the tragedy. Ford's pain made him incapable of recognizing love when it was standing right in front of him. And I want to pause here and really sit with this moment, because it's one of those small, quiet pivots on which entire lives turn. There's no explosion, no dramatic music, just a teenager standing in his family's living room, choosing a story about his brother's motivations that will shape the next 40 years of both their lives. We all do this. We all construct narratives about other people's intentions. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and you decide they're a terrible person, when maybe they're just rushing to the hospital. A friend forgets your birthday, and you decide they don't care, when maybe they're drowning in something they haven't told you about. A brother breaks your science project, and you decide he did it on purpose, when maybe he was just a scared kid who didn't know what else to do with his fear. The narratives we choose about other people say more about us than about them. Ford chose the narrative of deliberate sabotage because it confirmed something he already believed about the world. That people will hurt you if you let them close. That your achievements are under threat from the people around you. That the only safe position is above everyone else, where no one can reach your work. This belief didn't come from Stan. It came from a lifetime of being different in a world that punishes difference. It came from Crampleter and the other bullies. It came from Philbrick's conditional love. It came from the way other children looked at his hands. Ford had been collecting evidence for this belief his entire life, and the broken machine was the final, confirming piece. See, the world was right all along. People will hurt you. The only person you can trust is yourself. What Ford didn't realize, what he wouldn't realize for decades, was that the evidence was incomplete. For every Crampleter who mocked his hands, there was a Stan who celebrated them. For every rejection, there was a high six. The story Ford told himself about the world was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He was selecting the data that confirmed his hypothesis and ignoring the data that contradicted it. And if there's one thing a scientist should know, it's that confirmation bias will destroy your conclusions every time. But Ford, at 17, wasn't a scientist yet. He was a kid, a hurt, brilliant, frightened kid who had just lost the biggest opportunity of his life and needed someone to blame. And Stan was there. Stan was always there. And sometimes the people who are always there are the easiest people to blame because they're close enough to hit and too loyal to leave. Their father Philbrick reacted exactly the way you'd expect a man like Philbrick to react. He kicked Stan out. Not temporarily, not as a punishment with an end date, but permanently. Stan was told he couldn't come home until he'd made back the money Ford's scholarship would have been worth. He was a teenager, thrown out onto the street, and Ford watched it happen through a window. And here's the detail that kills me every time I think about it. Ford watched Stan leave through the window, and then he closed the blinds. He closed the blinds. That gesture carries so much weight. It's not that Ford didn't care. It's that Ford couldn't let himself care. Because caring would mean admitting that the thing he wanted most, his brother's love and presence, was being taken away, and he was partially responsible. It would mean admitting that maybe West Coast Tech and the perpetual motion machine and the whole trajectory of his brilliant future wasn't worth this. And Ford, at 17, wasn't capable of that kind of honesty. So he closed the blinds. He turned away. And he started building the version of himself that would carry him through the next 3 decades. The version that was smart enough to survive anything. The version that didn't need anyone. If you're still with me, take a breath. We're about to enter the part of Ford's story where things get complicated. And by complicated, I mean this is where a cartoon about a kid's summer vacation starts exploring loneliness and manipulation. And what happens when the smartest person in the room has no one to tell him he's making a terrible mistake? Ford didn't get into West Coast Tech. The broken machine saw to that. Instead, he went to Bill University, a school whose only notable distinction was, and I'm quoting the show here, it's mostly bug-free dorms. For someone who had been the golden child of Glass Shard Beach, someone who'd had representatives from the best school in the country come to see his work, Backupsmore must have felt like a punishment. Like the universe confirming what the bullies had always said. You're not special. You're not going anywhere. And here's something I think people miss about this part of Ford's story. Backupsmore wasn't just a lesser school. It was a humiliation. And humiliation, for someone like Ford, someone whose entire identity is constructed around being exceptional, is not just unpleasant. It's existentially threatening. Ford at Backupsmore was a concert pianist playing in a subway station, a Formula One driver in a go-kart. The mismatch between his ability and his environment wasn't just frustrating. It was a daily reminder that the universe didn't care how special he was. That talent alone wasn't enough. That circumstances, accidents, other people's actions, the random cruelty of a broken machine on the wrong night could derail everything. Some people, facing this kind of humiliation, would soften. They'd realize that their worth wasn't tied to their institution, They'd find meaning in the work itself rather than in the prestige surrounding it. But Ford went the other direction. He didn't soften. He hardened. He took the humiliation and converted it into fuel. Backup s'more would not define him. He would transcend it. He would be so productive, so brilliant, so overwhelmingly accomplished that the name on his degree wouldn't matter. And this worked, in the narrow sense that Ford's academic output was extraordinary. But it also deepened the pattern that was already destroying him. The pattern of using achievement to outrun shame. The pattern of responding to emotional pain with intellectual effort. The pattern of building upward, higher and higher, instead of building outward, toward the people around him. Ford at Backup s'more was laying the foundation for the isolation that would eventually lead him to a cave in the Oregon woods and a golden triangle with one eye. But here's where Ford's intelligence did serve him well, at least in the short term. He threw himself into his work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He completed his doctoral program 3 years ahead of schedule. He met a brilliant young engineer named Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, and they became something close to friends, though Ford was never great at friendship. Fiddleford was a tinkerer, a genius with machines, and together they made each other better. Ford helped McGucket with his theories about holographic universes, and McGucket provided the kind of practical, mechanical brilliance that complemented Ford's theoretical mind. And then Ford got the grant, $100,000, which in the late 1970s was an enormous sum, a nationally ranked thesis, and a pile of money, and the freedom to go anywhere, study anything, pursue whatever questions kept him up at night. And this is where Ford made the choice that would define the rest of his life. The choice that would lead him to Bill Cipher and the portal and 30 years of exile. He chose to study anomalies. And if you're enjoying this so far, a quick subscribe really does help. It's free, and it means we can keep making these long videos for you. Now, think about why Ford would choose anomalies. Not particle physics, not astrophysics, not any of the established fields where a mind like his could have flourished in relative safety. Anomalies. Things that don't fit. Things that are different. Things that exist outside the normal boundaries of what the world considers acceptable. Ford chose to study the things that were like him. His 6 fingers, his oddness, his sense of being fundamentally different from everyone around him. Ford didn't just want to catalog the weird, he wanted to understand it. He wanted to find a place in the universe where being different wasn't a liability, but a key to something greater. He wanted to prove that the things that made him strange were the things that made him valuable. And the place with the highest concentration of anomalies on the planet? Gravity Falls, Oregon. Ford moved there in the late 1970s. He built a house in the middle of the forest, far from town, far from anyone who might ask questions or offer company. Just Ford and his journals, and the endless, wonderful weirdness of the woods. He started cataloging everything. The gnomes, the floating eyeballs, the creatures that defied classification. He filled journal after journal with meticulous drawings and observations, each one marked with the symbol of a 6-fingered hand. That symbol. His symbol. The mark he put on his life's work was the same thing that had gotten him bullied, the same thing that had made him feel broken, the same thing that his brother had turned into a secret handshake. Ford reclaimed his 6 fingers as a mark of authority, but he did it alone. An authority, without anyone to share it with, is just isolation with a better vocabulary. For 6 years, Ford worked in Gravity Falls. 6 years of discoveries that would have rewritten every science textbook in the world. 6 years of absolute brilliance and absolute solitude. And I want to dwell on those 6 years because they're often treated as a montage, a brief interlude between Ford's academic career and the arrival of Bill Cipher. But 6 years is not brief. 6 years is 2,190 days. 6 years is 6 Christmases, 6 birthdays, 6 New Year's Eves, all spent alone in a cabin in the woods. 6 years of waking up with no one to say good morning to. 6 years of making discoveries that no one would ever see. 6 years of the kind of silence that doesn't just surround you, but inhabits you, fills the spaces where conversation used to be, replaces the warmth of human company with the cool, clinical hum of an empty house. I think about young Ford in that cabin, and I see someone who is performing a kind of slow self-burial. Each journal entry was another shovelful of dirt. Each creature cataloged, each anomaly documented, each equation solved was another layer between Ford and the world of human contact. He was building something magnificent, yes, but he was also building a tomb, his own tomb, a beautiful, meticulously organized tomb full of drawings and observations, and the unmistakable handwriting of a man who had no one to talk to. There's a phenomenon that researchers who study extreme isolation have documented. It's called the fading affect bias, and in normal social contexts, it describes how the emotional intensity of negative memories decreases faster than the intensity of positive ones. But in prolonged isolation, this bias reverses. The positive memories start to fade, and the negative ones sharpen. You start to forget what laughter sounds like, but you remember every insult. You lose the feeling of being hugged, but you retain, in vivid detail, the feeling of being pushed away. Ford, alone in his cabin for 6 years, was experiencing this reversal. The warmth of his childhood with Stan, the excitement of the high six, the dream of the Stano War, these things were fading. But the science fair, the closed blinds, the rejection from West Coast Tech, the feeling of being looked at as a freak, these memories were sharpening, getting brighter, getting louder. The negative experiences were becoming Ford's primary emotional landscape, and without anyone around to challenge that landscape, to say, hey, remember the good stuff too, the negativity became Ford's new normal. By the time Bill showed up, Ford wasn't just lonely. He was lonely in a way that had become structural. His loneliness wasn't a temporary condition waiting to be resolved. It was the architecture of his life. His cabin was designed for one person. His research methodology assumed a single researcher. His journals were written in a private shorthand that no collaborator could decipher. Ford had built an entire world around his solitude, and the only way into that world was through the door Ford himself controlled. Bill didn't come through the door. Bill came through the dream. He bypassed all of Ford's physical defenses, all his carefully constructed boundaries, and appeared in the one place Ford couldn't control, his unconscious mind. This is significant because it means that Ford's conscious defenses, his paranoia, his caution, his mistrust, were never tested. Bill operated below the level of Ford's awareness, in the realm of desire and need, and unexamined hunger. By the time Ford's conscious mind engaged with Bill, the emotional groundwork was already laid. Ford already felt close to Bill. Ford already trusted Bill. The decision had been made in the dream, and the waking mind was just ratifying it. This is one of the most psychologically astute details in the entire show. The idea that our most consequential decisions are often made below the level of conscious awareness, that the feelings come first and the reasons come after. Ford didn't rationally decide to trust Bill. He felt trust in his dreams, in his most vulnerable state, and then his brilliant analytical mind constructed an elaborate justification for that feeling. The incantation, the muse narrative, the chosen mind. All of it was post hoc reasoning layered on top of an emotional decision that Ford's loneliness had already made for him. And then he hit a wall. The anomalies of Gravity Falls were abundant, but they were also mysterious. Where did they come from? Why were they concentrated here? What was the source? Ford couldn't figure it out. His journals were full of data, but empty of answers. And for someone whose entire identity was built on being smart enough to solve any problem, the inability to crack this final puzzle was existentially threatening. If he couldn't solve this, What was he worth? That's when he found the cave. Deep in the woods of Gravity Falls, Ford discovered a cave with ancient paintings on the walls, hieroglyphics that predated any known civilization in the region. Images of a triangular figure with one eye, surrounded by symbols of power and destruction, and inscriptions that, if read aloud, would summon this figure into the mind of whoever spoke the words. There were warnings. There were explicit, clear warnings. And Ford, because Ford was Ford, because Ford had spent his entire life believing that he was the exception to every rule, read the words aloud. And that's how Bill Cipher entered the picture. Bill Cipher is, in my opinion, one of the most effective villains in the history of animated television. And the reason he's so effective is that he doesn't start as a villain. He starts as a friend. He starts as exactly the thing Ford needed most in the world. Someone who saw his brilliance and admired it. Someone who chose him. Someone who said, out of all the minds in all the dimensions, I picked yours. Bill appeared in Ford's dreams. A golden triangle with a top hat and a bow tie. Charming and funny and impossibly knowledgeable. He called himself a muse. He told Ford that once every century, he selected one extraordinary mind to inspire, one intellect worthy of the secrets of the universe. And Ford, brilliant, lonely, desperate Ford, believed him. Why wouldn't he? Think about Ford's life up to this point. His parents loved his brain. His school valued his brain. The grant recognized his brain. And now, a seemingly omniscient being was telling him that his brain was so special, so remarkable, that it had been chosen across all of reality. For someone who had spent his childhood being mocked for his hands and his awkwardness, someone who had never quite felt like he belonged anywhere, this was the ultimate validation. You are special. You are chosen. You are enough. And all Bill wanted in return was access. Permission to move in and out of Ford's mind. To share in his thoughts, his dreams, his discoveries. It seemed like nothing. It seemed like a gift. A brilliant mind and a cosmic intelligence working together to unlock the secrets of the universe. Here's what Bill actually wanted. Bill Cipher was a dream demon from a dying dimension called the Nightmare Realm. His reality was collapsing, and he needed a way into the physical world, a doorway, a portal that would allow him to merge his dimension with Earth and reshape reality according to his own chaotic desires. And Ford, with his brilliance and his isolation and his desperate need to be special, was the perfect tool to build that doorway. Bill didn't tell Ford any of this, of course. What he told Ford was that all of Gravity Falls anomalies originated from an extra-dimensional source, that there was a rift between worlds, and that building a portal to that rift would explain everything. All of Ford's questions, all of his years of research, all of his data about gnomes and floating cliffs and impossible creatures, it all led to one point. Build the portal, open the door, and everything would make sense. Ford started building. This is where Fiddleford McGucket comes back into the story, and his role in Ford's tragedy is one of the saddest parts of the whole thing. Ford called his old friend from Backupsmore and asked him to help build the portal. McGucket was a mechanical genius, the perfect partner for this kind of project. He came to Gravity Falls, he saw Ford's research, and he agreed to help. But Ford didn't tell McGucket about Bill. Think about that. Ford had a friend, a genuine, brilliant, trusting friend who came when Ford called and asked no questions and gave his skills freely. And Ford kept the most important detail of the entire project secret from him. Not because Ford was trying to deceive McGucket, exactly, but because Ford had already internalized the lesson Bill was teaching him. Other people are tools. Other people are means to an end. The real relationship, the real partnership, is between Ford and the entity that chose him. Bill was isolating Ford without Ford even realizing it. And this is how manipulation works, in fiction and in real life. The manipulator doesn't put up walls around you. They make you put up walls around yourself. They make you believe that the isolation is your choice, your preference, your intellectual superiority. Other people just wouldn't understand. Other people would slow you down. Other people aren't on your level. Ford built the portal with McGucket's help. They tested it. And during one of those tests, McGucket briefly crossed over. He entered the portal and saw what was on the other side. What he saw broke him. McGucket caught a glimpse of the nightmare realm. He saw Bill Cipher's true nature, the horror and chaos that waited on the other side of the doorway Ford was building. He came back screaming. He came back changed. And he told Ford they had to stop. He told Ford that the portal was a mistake, that whatever was on the other side was not what Ford thought it was, that they were in danger. Ford didn't listen. This is maybe the most damning moment in Ford's entire story, because unlike the science fair incident, where you could argue that Ford was a teenager reacting to trauma, this was an adult making a fully informed choice. His friend, his colleague, the person who had helped him build this thing, was standing in front of him terrified, telling him that they had made something dangerous. And Ford looked at that fear and dismissed it, because the portal was the pinnacle of his life's work, because Bill had told him it would change everything, because stopping would mean admitting that he might have been wrong, and Ford's identity couldn't survive being wrong. McGucket left, and what happened to him after that is one of the most quietly devastating subplots in Gravity Falls. Unable to live with what he had seen, McGucket built a memory-erasing gun, a device that could selectively remove specific memories from the user's mind. He used it on himself to forget the portal and the nightmare realm. But the relief was temporary, and the side effects were cumulative. He used it again, and again, and again. Each use damaged his mind a little more, took away a little more of who he was, until Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, one of the most brilliant engineers of his generation, was reduced to a babbling, incoherent figure living in the town dump. Old Man McGucket, the town lunatic. The person everyone laughed at and no one remembered had once been a genius. And all because he tried to help his friend, and his friend chose a demon over him. Ford is responsible for this. Not directly, not intentionally, but the chain of cause and effect is clear. Ford's need to be special led him to Bill. Bill led him to the portal. The portal destroyed McGucket. And Ford, wrapped up in his own cosmic importance, barely noticed. McGucket's story deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it's a kind of dark parallel to Ford's. Both men were brilliant. Both were destroyed by the portal project. But where Ford lost his freedom, McGucket lost his mind. And there's something deeply unsettling about the different ways the show and its characters respond to these two losses. Ford's exile in the multiverse is treated as tragic and heroic. He suffered, yes, but he also survived. He adapted. He continued to be brilliant, continued to document, continued to be Stanford Pines, even in the most inhospitable conditions imaginable. His suffering has a narrative shape to it. It's the hero's journey, the catabasis, the descent and return. There's dignity in it. McGucket's deterioration has no such dignity. There's nothing heroic about losing your mind. There's nothing narrative about the slow, grinding erosion of your identity through repeated self-inflicted memory erasure. McGucket doesn't descend into the underworld and return with wisdom. He descends into madness and stays there for decades, reduced to a figure of comedy, the crazy old man who lives in the junkyard and says nonsensical things. The town of Gravity Falls treats McGucket as a joke. They don't know what happened to him. They don't know that the babbling lunatic was once a genius who helped build a portal to another dimension. They don't know that his madness is a consequence of seeing something so terrible that he chose to destroy his own mind rather than live with the memory. And this is where the show gets quietly devastating. Because the memory gun, the device that destroyed McGucket, is the same device that eventually saves the world. The very thing that ruined one man's life becomes the tool that defeats Bill Cipher. McGucket's suffering isn't just tragic, it's instrumentally necessary. Without the memory gun, without McGucket's invention born of his own desperation, there would be no way to destroy Bill in Weirdmageddon. There's something almost unbearably cruel about this. McGucket's worst moment, his decision to erase his own memories, produces the artifact that makes the final victory possible. His pain has utility. His destruction has value. And I think this is something the show wants us to sit with, even if it doesn't say it explicitly. The question of whether it's acceptable to find meaning in someone else's suffering. The question of whether a good outcome justifies the horror that produced it. Ford would say no, I think. At least, the Ford who exists at the end of the series would say no. Because Ford, at the end, has learned that the cost of his ambitions was measured in people, not in equations. McGucket's mind was the price of the portal. Stan's memories were the price of defeating Bill. And no discovery, no matter how magnificent, is worth that price. But Ford didn't always believe this. Young Ford, ambitious Ford, Bill's favorite Ford, would have calculated the cost differently. He would have looked at McGucket's suffering and thought, tragic, but necessary. The portal is too important. The discovery is too significant. Individual suffering is regrettable, but acceptable in the pursuit of knowledge. This is the calculus of brilliance that the show is interrogating. The idea that some minds are more important than others. That some people's suffering matters less because their contributions matter less. That a genius's ambition outweighs an ordinary person's well-being. Ford was raised in this calculus. His father valued him more than Stan because he was smarter. His schools advanced him faster because his mind was more productive. Bill chose him because his intellect was more useful. Every system Ford moved through reinforced the message that brilliant people matter more. And McGucket's story is the direct rebuttal. McGucket was brilliant too. His contributions were essential. Without him, the portal would never have been built. But Ford treated him as a subordinate, kept secrets from him, and dismissed his warnings. And when McGucket paid the price for Ford's arrogance, the world forgot he'd ever been anything more than a lunatic. The redemption of McGucket, which happens gradually over the second season as pieces of his memory begin to return, is one of the show's quieter triumphs. By the time Weirdmageddon begins, McGucket has recovered enough of himself to be genuinely helpful. He builds the Shacktron, the giant robot made from the Mystery Shack that the Resistance uses to fight Bill's forces. He's still eccentric, still damaged, still not the man he was. But he's present. He's contributing. He's himself, or a version of himself, and that version is enough. I mention all of this because McGucket is, in many ways, the person Ford should have been. McGucket suffered because of the portal, just like Ford. But McGucket's response was different. Where Ford ran, McGucket stayed. Where Ford spent 30 years in other dimensions, McGucket spent 30 years in the same town, slowly losing himself, but never quite disappearing. And when the time came to help, when the world needed what he had to offer, McGucket was there. Damaged, yes. Diminished, yes. But there. Ford was there too, eventually. But it took a portal, 30 years, and an apocalypse to bring him back. McGucket never left. Now, eventually, Ford did figure it out. He confronted Bill. He demanded to know the truth about the portal, about what was really on the other side, about what would actually happen when it was fully activated. And Bill, because Bill had no more use for subtlety, dropped the act. Bill told Ford that when the portal opened, the people of Gravity Falls would learn to, and I'm paraphrasing here, party. Which sounds almost innocuous until you understand Bill's definition of a party, which involves reality itself being ripped apart and reshaped into a playground of chaos and horror. Weirdmageddon, the end of everything normal, the beginning of everything nightmarish. Ford shut the portal down. He hid his journals, splitting his life's work into 3 volumes and scattering them so that no one could ever reassemble the instructions to reactivate the machine. And he did one more thing. He called Stan. After years of silence. After the science fair and the estrangement and the blinds closing over the window. After everything. Ford called his twin brother and asked him to come to Gravity Falls. Not to reconcile. Not to apologize. Not to rebuild what they'd lost. Ford called Stan because he needed someone to take Journal 1 and hide it on the other side of the planet. He called his brother because he needed a courier. And Stan came. Because of course Stan came. Because Stan had spent the years since their father threw him out living in his car, running small-time scams, getting arrested, losing everything over and over again. And he still came when Ford called. Stan came because even after everything, even after the closed blinds and the silence and the exile, he still loved his brother. He still hoped, somewhere in the part of himself that refused to give up, that Ford would look at him and see a brother instead of a tool. Ford didn't see a brother. What happened in Ford's basement laboratory that night is shown in the episode A Tale of Two Stans, and it's one of the most emotionally complex scenes in the entire series. Ford explained the portal, explained the danger, explained that the journal needed to be taken far away. And Stan, hearing all of this, hearing that his brother had called him, not because he missed him, but because he needed a delivery boy, finally broke. They argued. Decades of hurt and misunderstanding and love twisted into resentment came pouring out. Stan accused Ford of thinking he was better than everyone. Ford accused Stan of ruining his life. They said the things that siblings say when they've been storing up pain like ammunition, the things that are designed to hit exactly where they'll hurt the most. And during the fight, Stan pushed Ford, or Ford fell, or the struggle knocked them both into the portal's controls. The specifics are chaotic and contested between the brothers themselves, but the result was undeniable. The portal activated, and Ford was pulled through. Stan reached for him. Ford reached back. Their hands almost touched. And then the portal swallowed Ford whole and shut down, out of power, with Stanford Pines on the wrong side of reality. Stan was alone in the basement. His brother was gone. And the only way to get him back was a machine that Ford had spent years trying to make sure could never be turned on again. If you're settling in, if your eyes are getting heavy, stay with me for just a little longer. Because what happens next is 30 years of 2 different kinds of loneliness, and both of them are devastating. Let's talk about what happened to Ford in those other dimensions. Because the show doesn't give us a complete picture, and honestly, that might be part of the point. Some pain is too vast to fully document. Some experiences can only be hinted at. What we know is this. Ford survived. For over 30 years, he traveled through hostile alternate dimensions, using shards of the portal technology to stabilize his presence in worlds that would otherwise have killed him. He built devices. He adapted. He fought. He documented everything he could in supplementary journals, filling pages with sketches of alien landscapes and notes on dimensional physics. But surviving is not the same as living. Ford was alone in the most absolute sense imaginable. Not alone in a room, not alone in a town, but alone in reality. There was no one from his world, no one who spoke his language, no one who shared his frame of reference. He encountered dimensions where gravity didn't exist, where time flowed backward, where human beings were prey. He learned to trust no one, because in many of these places, trust was a death sentence. And Bill was still there. Not physically, not always, but in Ford's mind. Bill Cipher had been in Ford's head, had shaped his thoughts, had whispered to him in dreams. That kind of violation doesn't just go away because you change dimensions. Ford carried Bill with him everywhere, a constant reminder of the worst mistake he'd ever made, the demon he'd invited in, the muse that turned out to be a monster. There's a psychological concept called complex post-traumatic stress, and it describes what happens to people who experience prolonged, repeated trauma, especially in situations where they can't escape. It's different from standard PTSD, which typically results from a single traumatic event. Complex trauma comes from ongoing exposure to danger, manipulation, and powerlessness. It rewires the brain. It makes you hypervigilant, paranoid, unable to trust, unable to relax, unable to believe that safety is real, even when you're safe. Ford experienced 30 years of complex trauma, 30 years of alien dimensions and constant danger, and the knowledge that his own arrogance had put him there. And when he finally came home, when Stan finally managed to reopen the portal and bring him back, Ford didn't come back as the brother Stan remembered. He came back as something harder, sharper, more broken. If this is the kind of content you enjoy, subscribing is the best way to make sure we keep going. It's completely free, and it really means a lot. I want to stay in those other dimensions for a moment, because I think the show does something very specific with Ford's exile, something that speaks to a deeper truth about suffering and what it does to people. There's a difference between suffering that teaches and suffering that just damages. We like to believe, culturally, that hardship makes you stronger, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes adversity reveals capacities you didn't know you had, forges resilience you couldn't have developed in comfort. But sometimes suffering just hurts. Sometimes it breaks things that can't be fixed. Sometimes 30 years of fighting to survive doesn't make you wise. It just makes you tired. Ford's 30 years in other dimensions did both. They made him resourceful, adaptable, physically and mentally tougher than almost anyone alive. But they also deepened every wound he already carried. The paranoia got worse. The isolation got worse. The inability to trust got worse. The contempt for vulnerability. The belief that needing someone is a weakness. The conviction that the only reliable thing in the universe is his own mind. All of it hardened and calcified over 3 decades of dimensional exile. And here's what nobody talks about when they discuss Ford's return. Ford came back old. Not just older. Everyone gets older. But aged in the way that extreme stress ages a person. The Ford who stepped through the portal was a man in his 30s, at the height of his intellectual powers, still capable of the kind of optimism that leads someone to build a machine that opens doors between worlds. The Ford who stepped back out was in his 60s, gray-haired and scarred, carrying 3 decades of survival on his back like a second skeleton. He missed everything. He missed the 80s, the 90s, the turn of the millennium. He missed technological revolutions and cultural shifts and the slow, ordinary passage of human history. He missed watching his brother age. He missed whatever happened to their parents. He missed the opportunity to have a normal life, a family, friendships, the quiet accumulation of years that gives most people a sense of continuity and place. When Ford stepped out of that portal, he was a man out of time, a stranger in a world that had moved on without him. And the person waiting for him, the only person who had been waiting, was the brother he blamed for putting him there. The emotional violence of that reunion can't be overstated. Stan had spent 30 years missing Ford. 30 years of grief and guilt and obsessive labor, all pointed toward one goal: bringing Ford home. And when Ford came home, the first thing he felt was rage. Not gratitude, not relief. Rage. I think about this a lot. The disproportion between Stan's sacrifice and Ford's reception of it. Because from Stan's perspective, reopening the portal was the greatest act of love he was capable of. He gave up his identity. He gave up his freedom, spending years hiding from the authorities because Stanford Pines was technically dead, and Stanley Pines was technically a wanted man. He gave up 30 years of his life, the best years, the years when people usually build careers and families and communities. He gave all of it to a hole in the basement and a brother who, when he finally climbed out of that hole, punched him in the face. And Ford's rage isn't irrational, from Ford's perspective. Ford had asked Stan to take the journal and hide it. That's all. A simple mission. Take this book. go somewhere far away, keep it safe. And instead, Stan had argued they'd fought, and Ford had been sucked into the portal. From Ford's extremely limited and self-centered point of view, Stan had once again ruined everything by not listening. But of course, that's not what happened. What happened was that Stan refused to play the role Ford had assigned him. Stan refused to be a courier. Stan wanted to be a brother. And Ford, unable to see past his own narrative of betrayal, interpreted that refusal as another act of sabotage. This is the dynamic that makes Ford and Stan's relationship so achingly realistic. They're both right. They're both wrong. They both have legitimate grievances and legitimate blind spots. Stan's carelessness did damage Ford's life. Ford's arrogance did damage Stan's life. They are each the architect of the other's worst moments and the source of the other's deepest love. And disentangling those threads, separating the love from the harm, the gratitude from the resentment, the brother from the burden, is the work of the entire second season. Now, let's talk about Stan's side of those 30 years, but only briefly, because it matters for Ford's story. Stanley Pines spent 3 decades in that basement trying to reopen the portal. He taught himself advanced physics. He taught himself engineering. The man who had been kicked out of his house for not being the smart one became, through sheer desperate love, smart enough to rebuild an interdimensional gateway. He also took over Ford's house and identity. He opened the Mystery Shack, a tourist trap that used Gravity Falls weirdness as a money-making scheme. He pretended to be Stanford. He hid the portal in the basement. And he never, not once, stopped working to get his brother back. 30 years. Think about that. 30 years of studying and failing and trying again. 30 years of living in his brother's house, surrounded by his brother's things, pretending to be his brother while simultaneously trying to save his brother. Stan's devotion is almost incomprehensible. And the tragedy is that when Ford finally came back, he couldn't see it for what it was. The episode is called Not What He Seems, and it's widely regarded as one of the best episodes of the entire series. Dipper and Mabel, Stan's great-niece and great-nephew who have been staying at the Mystery Shack for the summer, discover the portal in the basement. They discover that Stan has been lying to them. They discover that everything they thought they knew about their great-uncle is wrong. And as the portal activates and gravity itself starts to break down, they have to decide whether to trust Stan or to shut it down. Mabel trusts him. She falls backward into the air, reaches past the abort button, and lets the portal do its thing. And out of the light steps a figure with 6 fingers. Stanford Pines is home. But here's what's important about Ford's return, and this is where the tragedy deepens. Ford comes through that portal, and the first thing he does, the very first thing, after 30 years of exile and suffering and loneliness, is punch his brother in the face. Not hug him, not thank him, not say, "I'm home, I missed you, I'm sorry." He punches him. Because Ford is furious. Because in Ford's mind, Stan is the one who broke the perpetual motion machine and ruined his life. In Ford's mind, the last 30 years are Stan's fault. The portal, the exile. All of it traces back to that night in the lab, which traces back to the science fair, which traces back to the moment Stan's carelessness destroyed everything Ford had built. Ford has been nursing this grudge across dimensions. For 30 years, in the dark places between worlds, Ford has been telling himself a story. And the story goes like this. I was brilliant. I was chosen. I was going to unlock the secrets of the universe. And my brother, my careless, reckless, stupid brother, ruined everything. Twice. First the machine, then the portal. It's easier to be angry at Stan than it is to be angry at himself. Because if Ford is honest, really honest, the timeline of blame goes like this. Ford pushed Stan away. Ford closed the blinds. Ford chose to study alone in the woods. Ford summoned Bill. Ford built the portal. Ford ignored McGucket's warnings. Ford called Stan only when he needed something. Ford started the fight in the basement. At every critical juncture, Ford had a choice between connection and isolation, between trust and paranoia, between admitting he was wrong and doubling down on being right. And every single time, he chose wrong. But Ford can't see that yet. Not in A Tale of Two Stans. Not for a while. Because the thing about being the smartest person in the room is that you always have a good explanation for why nothing is your fault. Ford's return creates a new dynamic in the Mystery Shack, and it's one that mirrors the original tragedy in unsettling ways. Ford and Stan are under the same roof again, but they can barely speak to each other. Ford wants his house back. He wants his identity back. He wants Stan to close the Mystery Shack and give back everything he's been using for 30 years. And Stan, who has spent those 30 years sacrificing everything to save Ford, who literally gave up his own identity to keep the Portal Project going, is being told that none of it matters. That he's still the screw-up. That he's still the one who ruined things. And then there are the kids. Dipper and Mabel, 12 years old, spending their summer with a great uncle they thought they knew. Dipper in particular is drawn to Ford. They're alike. They're both curious, both intellectual, both a little awkward, both desperate to prove themselves. Ford sees himself in Dipper, and Dipper sees in Ford the kind of adult he wants to become. Someone who went on adventures, who documented the unknown, who was brave enough to explore what no one else would. This is beautiful and dangerous at the same time. Because Ford's attention to Dipper mirrors Bill's attention to Ford. Not in its malice, Ford genuinely cares about Dipper, but in its structure. An older, powerful figure singles out a younger, eager mind and says, "You're special. You're different from everyone else. I choose you." And the thing that's being offered, knowledge, adventure, an apprenticeship in the extraordinary, is the same thing Bill offered Ford. The same lure, the same hook. Ford isn't Bill. Ford would never deliberately hurt Dipper. But Ford is repeating the pattern without realizing it, because the pattern is all he knows. You find someone brilliant. You pull them close. You separate them from the people who love them. You make them feel like their value lies in their mind, and their mind alone. Mabel sees this happening. She feels Dipper pulling away, gravitating toward Ford, becoming someone who might choose intellectual adventure over his twin sister. And Mabel, in her own 12-year-old way, is terrified. Because she knows, without being able to articulate it, that this is how Ford and Stan started. Two twins who loved each other. One who was special. One who was left behind. Stan sees it too. And here's where Stan does something that Ford never could. Stan looks at Dipper and Ford bonding, and instead of feeling threatened, instead of trying to compete, instead of pulling Dipper away, he encourages it. He tells Dipper it's okay to spend time with Ford. He tells Dipper that Ford is worth getting to know. Stan, who has every reason to be jealous and resentful, puts the kid's needs above his own pain. Because Stan, for all his flaws, understands something that Ford has never grasped. Love isn't a competition. There isn't a limited supply. Dipper can love Ford and love Stan. Mabel can love them both. The family doesn't have to fracture. Ford learns this. Eventually. But not before things get worse. There's an episode called The Last Mabelcorn, and it's the episode where the truth about Bill Cipher becomes fully known to the rest of the characters. Dipper, curious about Ford's past, uses a device to peek into Ford's dreams. What he sees is disturbing. Ford, in his sleep, is talking to Bill. Not willingly, but the connection is still there. The channel that Ford opened when he read those words in the cave has never fully closed. Dipper also finds Ford's study, and he discovers that it's essentially a shrine to Bill Cipher. Notes, drawings, theories, the accumulated evidence of years of obsession. From the outside, it looks like Ford might still be working with Bill. Like he might still be an ally of the demon who nearly destroyed everything. When Dipper confronts him, Ford tells the truth. All of it. The cave. The incantation. Bill's flattery. the portal, McGucket, the exile. Ford sits with this 12-year-old kid and explains how he was manipulated by something he thought was a friend, how he gave his trust to an entity that used it to nearly destroy the world, how the smartest thing he ever did was also the stupidest. And this confession is important because it's one of the first times Ford is honest about his own culpability. He doesn't say Bill tricked me and leave it at that. He says I was vulnerable. I was lonely. I wanted to believe. He owns the emotional truth of what happened, even if he can't yet see how it connects to everything else in his life. Here's something I want you to think about as you're lying there, maybe with your eyes closed, maybe drifting a little. Ford's story with Bill Cipher is, at its core, a story about abuse. Not physical abuse, though that comes later. Psychological abuse. Emotional manipulation. The slow, deliberate process by which someone identifies your deepest need, presents themselves as the answer to that need, isolates you from everyone who might challenge their influence, and then uses you for their own purposes. Bill found Ford when Ford was alone. Bill told Ford he was special when Ford desperately needed to hear it. Bill encouraged Ford to push away his remaining connections, to focus entirely on the work, to forget his brother. Bill gave Ford just enough truth to make the lies invisible. And when Ford finally saw what was happening, it was almost too late. This is how abusers operate. This is the pattern, whether we're talking about a dream demon in a cartoon or a real person in a real relationship. They find the crack. They pour themselves in. They make you believe that the cage is a castle. And by the time you realize the door is locked, you've forgotten what the key looks like. Ford's six-fingered handshake with Stan was a key. His friendship with McGucket was a key. Every genuine human connection he ever had was a potential way out, and Bill convinced him to throw them all away. And the worst part? Ford couldn't even blame Bill entirely, because Bill didn't hold a gun to Ford's head. Bill didn't force Ford to read the incantation, or build the portal, or ignore McGucket's warnings, or push Stan away. Bill offered, and Ford accepted. Every step of the way, Ford had agency. And that's what makes the manipulation so insidious. The victim is complicit in their own destruction, and that complicity becomes its own source of shame, its own reason to never ask for help, its own prison. I want to stay with this idea of complicity for a moment longer, because it's one of the most uncomfortable aspects of Ford's story, and I think it's also one of the most honest. We live in a culture that likes clean narratives about victimhood. There are good people and bad people, and the bad people do bad things to the good people, and the good people are blameless. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes the victim bears no responsibility at all. But more often, especially in cases of psychological manipulation, the picture is muddier. The victim's own desires, their own weaknesses, their own unmet needs, these become the tools of their exploitation. And acknowledging this isn't the same as blaming the victim. It's recognizing the full complexity of what happened. Ford wanted to be chosen. That's not a flaw. That's a human need. Everyone wants to be chosen. Everyone wants to feel like they matter to someone, like their existence has been noticed and valued by another consciousness. The problem isn't that Ford wanted this. The problem is that he wanted it so badly and had received it so rarely that when it finally appeared, he couldn't examine it critically. He was starving, and Bill offered food, and hungry people don't check for poison. This is what makes Bill Cipher such a sophisticated villain. He doesn't attack Ford's weaknesses from the outside. He makes Ford's weaknesses attack Ford from the inside. Bill turns Ford's loneliness into a weapon. He turns Ford's intelligence into a trap. He turns Ford's deepest, most human desires into the mechanism of his own downfall. And the genius of it is that Ford, even after discovering the truth, can't fully separate the manipulation from the genuine emotions he felt. The excitement of the discoveries was real. The intellectual communion was, from Ford's perspective, real. The feeling of being understood for the first time in his life was devastatingly real. Bill was lying, but Ford's feelings weren't lies. And that paradox, the coexistence of real emotion and manufactured connection, is what makes the aftermath so painful. Ford can't just hate Bill. He also has to mourn Bill. He has to grieve the loss of the relationship he thought he had, even as he recognizes that the relationship never existed. He has to miss the muse while knowing the muse was a monster. And that kind of dual consciousness, holding love and betrayal in the same hand, is one of the hardest psychological states a person can endure. There's a term for this in the literature on abusive relationships. It's called traumatic bonding. It describes the strong emotional attachment that forms between an abuser and their victim, particularly when the abuse is interspersed with periods of kindness or normalcy. The cycle of manipulation followed by validation, of cruelty followed by warmth, creates a bond that's almost chemically addictive. The victim's brain becomes wired to crave the good moments because the bad moments have made the good moments feel essential. The relief of kindness after cruelty is more intense than kindness that was never interrupted, and the brain starts to confuse intensity with intimacy. Ford was traumatically bonded to Bill, not in the way that term usually applies to human relationships, but the psychological mechanism is the same. Bill alternated between cosmic revelation and subtle degradation. He'd give Ford an incredible insight and then subtly remind him that he couldn't have achieved it alone. He'd open doors to impossible knowledge and then position himself as the only one who could keep those doors open. Ford's mind was simultaneously expanded and constrained, his potential simultaneously celebrated and controlled. When you're inside that kind of dynamic, you don't feel trapped. You feel grateful. You feel like you're the lucky one, the chosen one, the one who gets to see what no one else sees. The cage is invisible because the bars are made of the very things you've always wanted. Ford's 30 years in other dimensions can be read, in this light, as the longest withdrawal in fictional history. Not just withdrawal from Bill's influence, but withdrawal from the pattern of seeking validation through extraordinary connection. Ford in the multiverse is Ford cold turkey. No muse, no mentor, no entity whispering that he's special. Just the raw, unmediated experience of existing without anyone to reflect his value back at him. And it almost destroyed him. Not the physical dangers, though those were real. The psychological desolation. The slow realization that without someone telling him he mattered, Ford couldn't quite convince himself that he did. His identity had been so thoroughly outsourced, first to his parents' expectations, then to academia, then to Bill, that when all of those external sources were removed, Ford had to confront the void underneath. Who is Stanford Pines without someone to impress? That's the question the multiverse asked him, every day, for 30 years. And Ford's answer, for most of those years, was to keep moving, keep documenting, keep surviving, keep the journals going, keep the observations flowing, keep the mind busy so it doesn't have time to sit with the emptiness. Ford's survival strategy in the multiverse was the same strategy he'd used his entire life. When the feelings get too close, think harder. When the loneliness gets too real, discover something. When the question of who you are without your achievements becomes too loud, achieve something else. But the multiverse is relentless. It strips away pretense. When you're running from an alien predator on a planet where the sky is the color of disease, when you're navigating a dimension where the fundamental constants of physics are different and your equations don't work, when you're absolutely and totally alone in the most literal sense possible, the mind's usual defenses start to crack. The achievements don't matter because there's no one to show them to. The journals don't matter because there's no one to read them. The intelligence doesn't matter because being the smartest person on a dead planet is exactly as useful as being the dumbest. This is where Ford's story intersects with some very old philosophical questions about the nature of meaning. If a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If a genius discovers something extraordinary and there's no one to share it with, does it matter? The existentialists would say no. Not because the discovery isn't real, but because meaning, real meaning, the kind that sustains a person through 30 years of exile, doesn't come from the discovery itself. It comes from the relationship between the discoverer and their world. It comes from the telling, the sharing, the look on someone's face when you explain something incredible, the sound of someone saying, "Wow, tell me more." Ford lost all of that when he fell through the portal, and without it, his discoveries were magnificent and empty, beautiful and pointless, like a symphony performed in a vacuum. There's a philosopher named Hannah Arendt who wrote about the concept of natality, the capacity of human beings to begin something new, to bring something into the world that wasn't there before. Arendt believed that natality is what gives human life its meaning and its fragility. We create, we discover, we build, we begin. But the things we begin only matter if they're witnessed. If they enter the public realm, the shared space where other people can encounter them and respond to them. Without witnesses, without a public, our creations are stillborn. They exist, but they don't matter. Ford's journals are full of natality, full of beginnings, of new ideas, of unprecedented observations. But in the multiverse, they had no public, no witnesses. They were letters with no addresses, songs with no audience, conversations with no second voice. And this, I think, is why Ford came back from the multiverse so damaged. Not because of the physical hardship. Ford could handle that. He's tough, he's resourceful, he's brilliant. What damaged him was the meaninglessness. The slow, corrosive understanding that everything he did, everything he discovered, everything he survived, was happening in a void. And the void didn't care. Let's move forward. Let's talk about Weirdmageddon. This is the climax of everything. All the threads, all the decades of pain and mistake and consequence, converging into one apocalyptic event. Bill Cipher finally gets what he wants. A rift between dimensions opens over Gravity Falls, and Bill pours through with his nightmare horde, reshaping reality into a hellscape of chaos and terror. The sky turns red. The laws of physics stop working. People are turned to stone, transformed into furniture, trapped in bubbles of their own fantasies. And Ford, the man who started all of this, who opened the door that let Bill in, is right in the middle of it. Bill captures Ford during Weirdmageddon, and what he does to him is cruel in a way that goes beyond physical violence. Bill turns Ford into gold, literally transforms him into a golden statue. And then Bill uses that statue, this frozen effigy of the man he manipulated and betrayed and discarded, as a backscratcher. Think about the symbolism there. Ford wanted to be golden. He wanted to be special, exceptional, valuable. And Bill gave him exactly that, in the most degrading way possible. You wanted to be a trophy? Fine. You're a trophy. A decoration. An object. All that intelligence, all that ambition, all those years of suffering, reduced to something Bill uses to scratch an itch and then sets aside. It's humiliation as a form of revenge. Bill is saying, this is what you always were to me. Not a partner, not a chosen mind, a tool, a thing. And now you can spend eternity being exactly as valuable as I always considered you. But Ford is freed. The resistance, led by Stan and the kids, fights back. And here's where Ford and Stan have to make the biggest decision of their lives. They know that Bill can only be destroyed from inside a mindscape, that the memory gun can erase anything within a mind, including a demon. But Bill needs to be tricked into entering someone's mind willingly, and the bait has to be convincing. Ford and Stan switch identities. They switch clothes, they switch mannerisms, they become each other. Ford pretends to be Stan, and Stan pretends to be Ford. And when Bill comes for Ford's mind, for the intellect he's been obsessed with, he enters Stan's mind instead. And Ford shoots his brother with the memory gun. Let that sink in. Ford, who has spent his entire life defined by his intellect, watches as his brother's mind, Stan's memories of their childhood, of the Stano War, of the High Six, of every fight and every moment of love, is erased, completely, permanently. Stan chose this. Stan volunteered. Stan said, "Let Bill into my mind and then erase everything, because that's the only way to destroy him and save the world." And Ford, who has made every wrong choice at every critical moment for 40 years, finally makes the right one. He lets his brother be the hero. He lets go of his pride, his need to be the one who fixes things, his compulsion to be the smartest person in the room, and he lets Stan save the world. But the cost of that choice. Stan defeats Bill. The memory gun fires, and inside Stan's mind, Bill Cipher is destroyed, screaming and reaching out for a deal that no one takes. The nightmare ends. Reality reassembles itself. Gravity Falls is saved. And Stan doesn't know who anyone is. He sits in the wreckage of the Mystery Shack, surrounded by people who love him, and he looks at them with blank eyes. No recognition, no memory, no Stanley. Just an empty man in a fez, trying to figure out why everyone around him is crying. For Ford, this is the final weight, the ultimate consequence. Not of his own actions directly, but of the chain of events that his choices set in motion decades ago. If Ford hadn't summoned Bill, if Ford hadn't built the portal, if Ford hadn't pushed his brother away, none of this would have happened. Stan wouldn't be sitting there, hollow, because there would have been no Bill to destroy and no sacrifice to make. Quick reminder, if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does make a difference. It helps us keep making these long, thoughtful videos for you. But here's where the story does something remarkable. Something that elevates it from tragedy to something closer to redemption. The kids don't give up. Dipper and Mabel sit with Stan, and they show him the scrapbook that Mabel has been keeping all summer. Photos and ticket stubs and drawings and notes. The artifacts of a single summer. A collection of memories that prove to Stan that he was loved, that he mattered, that his life had meaning, even if he can't remember it. And slowly, impossibly, it works. Stan starts to remember. A flash here, a fragment there, a word that sounds familiar, a face that feels safe. The process is gradual and heartbreaking and beautiful, and by the end, Stan is back. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough. The love of his family, literally the physical evidence of connection and joy and shared experience, pulls him back from the void. And Ford is there for all of it. Ford, who closed the blinds when Stan was kicked out. Ford, who didn't call for decades. Ford, who punched his brother in the face when he came through the portal. Ford is there, watching his brother come back to life. And for the first time, Ford understands what he's been missing. It was never about the portal. It was never about the anomalies. It was never about being the smartest person in the room or the chosen mind of a cosmic entity. It was about this: people, family. The kind of love that doesn't ask you to be brilliant, that doesn't require you to discover anything, that just wants you to show up and be present and not close the blinds. The series ends with Ford and Stan finally fulfilling the promise they made as children. They rebuild the Stano War. They name it the Stano War 2, and they set sail together to explore the world and investigate anomalies. But this time, it's different. This time, it's not Ford alone in a basement with a demon whispering in his ear. This time, it's two brothers, side by side, doing together what they always should have done together from the very start. I want to sit with that image for a moment, because I think it's the most powerful thing in the entire series. Two old men on a boat. The boat they dreamed about when they were kids, when the world hadn't broken them yet, when Glass Shard Beach was just a beach and not a metaphor for everything that would go wrong. They're sailing. Finally sailing. And the fact that it took them this long, that they had to lose everything and nearly lose each other, makes the sailing itself feel like a miracle. This is what redemption looks like in Gravity Falls. It doesn't look like a grand gesture or a magical fix. It looks like two people who hurt each other terribly, deciding at the end of everything that the hurting isn't worth it, that the grudge isn't worth it, that being right isn't worth it. It looks like Ford putting down his journals and picking up an oar, and Stan putting down his con man shtick and picking up the other one. Now, I want to go deeper. I want to talk about what Ford represents, not just as a character, but as an idea. Because Ford's story isn't really about portals and demons. It's about something much more common and much more dangerous. It's about what happens when you're so afraid of being ordinary that you'll sacrifice everything for the chance to be extraordinary. There's a philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard who wrote about this. Kierkegaard talked about the self as something that exists in relation to other things, to other people, to the world, to some idea of the infinite. And he said that the most common form of despair, the most common way that people lose themselves, isn't through suffering or loss. It's through the desperate attempt to be something they're not. Ford's despair, Kierkegaard would say, is the despair of wanting to be a self that doesn't need anyone. Ford wants to be the lone genius, the singular mind, the man who needs nothing but his intellect and his journals. And this desire, this frantic grasping at self-sufficiency, is itself a form of self-destruction. Because the self that Ford is trying to be doesn't exist. It can't exist. Human beings are not designed for total isolation. Our minds, our identities, our very sense of who we are, these things are built in relationship. They're built in the space between people, in the conversations, and the arguments, and the shared meals, and the stupid handshakes. Ford tried to build a self without any of that, and the self he built was hollow, smart, yes. Accomplished, yes, but hollow. A brilliant shell with nothing warm inside it. And Bill Cipher was the thing that crawled into that hollowness and made itself at home. Let me tell you something about loneliness that I think Ford's story illustrates better than almost anything else in popular culture. Loneliness isn't just an emotion. It's a state that changes how you think. Research in psychology has shown that prolonged loneliness actually alters brain function. It increases activity in the threat surveillance systems of the brain, making you more paranoid, more suspicious, more likely to interpret neutral events as hostile. It decreases activity in the regions associated with empathy and social cognition, making it harder to read other people's emotions and intentions. Loneliness makes you worse at the exact things you'd need to be good at to stop being lonely. Ford was lonely for most of his adult life, and you can see the effects. His paranoia, which was notable enough that his high school classmates voted him most paranoid, got worse with every year of isolation. By the time Stan found him again, Ford was, as described in the show's lore, borderline insane with paranoia, confined in his shack and unable to trust anyone. And this is the cruelest irony of Ford's story. His loneliness made him vulnerable to Bill. Bill exploited that vulnerability. The exploitation made Ford more isolated, which made him lonelier, which made him more vulnerable. It's a feedback loop, a spiral. The same spiral that traps real people in abusive relationships, in addiction, in depression. The thing that's hurting you is also the thing that makes you unable to escape the thing that's hurting you. I keep coming back to the hands, the 6 fingers, because they're not just a character detail, they're the physical manifestation of everything Ford's story is about. Ford's hands are different. They're not wrong. Medically speaking, hexadactyly is harmless. But they're different. And Ford grew up in a world that treated different as defective. What if Ford had grown up somewhere else? What if he'd grown up with parents who celebrated his hands instead of quietly tolerating them? What if he'd gone to a school where the other kids thought 6 fingers were fascinating instead of freakish? What if someone, just one person, had sat him down when he was young and said, "Your hands are remarkable, and your mind is remarkable, and you don't have to choose between being loved and being brilliant"? The Stano War handshake was that. The high 6 was exactly that gesture of acceptance. But it came from another child. From someone who didn't have the power or the vocabulary to make it stick. Stan could show Ford that he was accepted, but he couldn't protect Ford from a world that didn't agree. And so Ford spent his life trying to prove that world wrong, trying to be so exceptional that the hands wouldn't matter. And in the process, he lost the one person who had always thought the hands were the best part. There's a moment in developmental psychology that researchers call the looking glass self. It's the idea that our sense of who we are is formed by how we see ourselves reflected in other people's reactions to us. If people look at you with fear, you learn to see yourself as frightening. If people look at you with admiration, you learn to see yourself as admirable. If people look at your hands and wince, you learn to see your hands as something to hide. Ford's looking glass was cracked from the start. The reflection he got from the world told him he was brilliant, but broken. Special, but wrong. And he spent his entire life trying to fix the reflection instead of fixing the mirror. Bill Cipher was a funhouse mirror. He showed Ford a reflection that was perfect, flattering, exactly what Ford wanted to see. "You're not broken," Bill said. "You're chosen. Your hands aren't a flaw. They're a mark of destiny." And Ford, who had never seen that reflection before, who had been waiting his entire life for someone to show him that image, stared into it and believed every distortion. Let me talk about trust for a moment. Because trust is the thread that runs through Ford's entire story, the thing that breaks and heals and breaks again. Ford trusted Stan. As a kid, completely and without reservation. And when he believed Stan had betrayed him, that trust shattered so completely that it took 30 years and an apocalypse to reassemble. Ford trusted Bill, as an adult, completely and without reservation. And when Bill's betrayal was revealed, the damage was even worse than what Stan had done, because this time Ford couldn't claim innocence. He'd been warned. He'd ignored the warnings. He'd chosen to trust a demon over a friend, and the friend had paid the price. After Bill, Ford trusted no one. Not for 30 years. 30 years of alien dimensions and constant danger, and the certain knowledge that the last time he'd trusted someone, he'd nearly destroyed the world. By the time he came home, Ford's trust was a shattered window, and the idea of letting anyone close enough to break it again was unbearable. And yet, Dipper. There's something I want to explore about why Ford was able to open up to Dipper when he couldn't open up to anyone else. Because I think the answer reveals something fundamental about how trust works, and about the specific kind of vulnerability that children can unlock in adults. Dipper was 12 years old when Ford met him. A child. Not yet hardened by the world. Not yet capable of the kind of strategic manipulation that Ford's paranoia was calibrated to detect. When Ford looked at Dipper, his threat assessment systems, the ones that had been running at full power for 30 years, couldn't find a target. Dipper was too young, too earnest, too transparently excited about Ford's work to register as a danger. And more than that, Dipper looked at Ford the way Ford had always wanted to be looked at. With wonder, with admiration, with the kind of uncomplicated awe that children feel in the presence of someone who knows things they don't. Dipper didn't see Ford's paranoia, or his guilt, or his broken relationship with Stan. He saw a mysterious genius who had traveled through other dimensions and filled journals with incredible discoveries. He saw the version of Ford that Ford had always wanted to be. In a way, Dipper gave Ford the same thing Bill gave him: validation, admiration, the feeling of being chosen. But where Bill's admiration was calculated, Dipper's was genuine. Where Bill was using Ford's need against him, Dipper was simply responding to someone he found fascinating. The same hook, but attached to something real. And this is the key to Ford's healing. Not the portal, not the apocalypse, not the dramatic confrontation with Bill. A kid. A 12-year-old kid with a pine tree hat and a journal full of his own notes, who looked at Ford Pines and saw someone worth knowing, someone worth trusting, someone who, despite everything he'd done wrong, was still capable of being a good person. Dipper's trust in Ford was a mirror too, but unlike the funhouse mirror of Bill's flattery or the cracked mirror of the world's rejection, Dipper's mirror was clean. It reflected Ford accurately. It said, "You're brilliant, and you're broken, and you've made terrible mistakes, and you're still someone I want to learn from." It said, "I see all of you, not just the impressive parts, and I'm still here." Ford needed that. He needed someone to see him fully and stay. And Dipper, with the innocence that only a child can offer, gave him that gift. But Ford almost ruined it. Because Ford, being Ford, couldn't just accept Dipper's admiration as a gift. He had to turn it into a project. He had to make Dipper his apprentice, his protege, his continuation. He had to turn a relationship of genuine warmth into a structure of mentorship and hierarchy. Because Ford didn't know how to be loved without being needed, didn't know how to be close to someone without being above them. This is the final temptation of the gifted person. The belief that love must be justified. That you earn closeness through usefulness. That someone can only care about you if you're teaching them something, showing them something, elevating them in some way. Ford couldn't just be Dipper's great uncle. He had to be Dipper's mentor. Because in Ford's calculus, uncle is ordinary, and ordinary doesn't deserve love. Mentor is exceptional, and exceptional might, if you're lucky, earn enough respect to approximate something close to affection. But Dipper didn't want a mentor. Or rather, he wanted a mentor, but he also wanted a family member. He wanted someone to play dungeons, and more dungeons with on a lazy afternoon. He wanted someone to geek out with about weird creatures in the forest. He wanted the kind of connection that doesn't require a formal title or a structured curriculum. The kind that just happens when two people who think in similar ways spend time together. And in the end, Dipper showed Ford something revolutionary. He showed Ford that you could be brilliant and ordinary at the same time. That you could love mysteries and love your sister. That you could want to explore the unknown and also want to go home. That intelligence and connection weren't opposing forces. They were complementary ones. Two hands, if you'll forgive the metaphor, that worked better together than apart. Ford trusted Dipper. Not immediately, not easily, but he did. He saw in Dipper the same curiosity, the same hunger for answers, the same sense of being different in a world that rewards sameness. And he let Dipper in. He told Dipper about Bill. He showed Dipper his journals. He offered Dipper a future as his apprentice, a life of adventure and discovery. And Dipper, in the end, chose Mabel instead. This is one of the most important moments in Gravity Falls, and it's important specifically because of what it means for Ford. Dipper chooses his twin. He chooses connection over ambition, family over adventure, his sister over the most exciting opportunity he's ever been offered. He makes the choice that Ford couldn't make at the same age. He looks at the brilliant, extraordinary future that Ford is offering and says, "No, I'd rather go home with my sister." And Ford, watching Dipper make that choice, has to reckon with what it means. Because Dipper is Ford. Dipper is what Ford was, 30-something years ago, standing at the same crossroads. And Dipper chose differently. Dipper chose the twin, which means Ford could have chosen the twin. Ford could have chosen Stan. Ford could have said, "You know what? West Coast tech doesn't matter. The perpetual motion machine doesn't matter. Glass Shard Beach is fine if we're there together. Ford could have closed the distance instead of closing the blinds. He didn't. And the weight of that, the realization that the tragedy of his life was not inevitable, that it was a choice, is the thing that finally breaks Ford open. I want to talk about something that I think gets overlooked in discussions about Ford. The show treats Ford's intelligence as both a gift and a curse, and it does so with remarkable nuance. Ford is never portrayed as wrong for being smart. The show never suggests that Ford should have been less curious, less driven, less ambitious. Intelligence is a good thing. The pursuit of knowledge is a noble thing. Ford's journals, his research, his discoveries, these are genuine accomplishments that the show celebrates. What the show criticizes is not Ford's intelligence, but his isolation. Not his ambition, but his inability to share it. The problem was never that Ford wanted to understand the universe. The problem was that he wanted to understand it alone. And this is an important distinction because a lot of stories about gifted people take the easy route. They say, see, being smart is bad, you should just be normal. Or they say, the smart one was right all along, everyone else was holding them back. Gravity Falls doesn't do either of these things. It says, being smart is wonderful, and being connected to other people is also wonderful. And if you can't have both at the same time, you need to figure out why. Because the answer is almost certainly not that you're too brilliant for love. Ford's 6 fingers could type and draw and build things that no one else could build. But they were also made for a handshake that required another person to complete. Let me go deeper on something here, because I think there's a layer to Ford's story that we often skip past too quickly. The way the show handles the question of accountability is really remarkable. Because Ford is simultaneously the architect of his own destruction and a victim of forces beyond his control. And the show refuses to collapse that complexity into something simpler. Think about the chain of events from Ford's perspective. He was born different in a world that punishes difference. He was raised by a father who measured love in achievement. He lost his dream school because of an accident that felt like a betrayal. He went to a lesser university, worked harder than anyone around him, and still ended up alone in the woods because the academic system he climbed through didn't actually care about him as a person, only about what his mind could produce. And when a cosmic being appeared in his dreams and offered the one thing no human had ever offered, unconditional intellectual admiration, he said yes. Is Ford responsible for saying yes? Absolutely. But the world that made yes the obvious answer bears responsibility too. Ford didn't develop his vulnerabilities in a vacuum. They were shaped by every teacher who valued his grades over his well-being, every peer who mocked his hands, every institution that said we want your brain, but not your problems. Ford is the product of a system that creates brilliant, lonely people, and then acts surprised when those people make desperate choices. This is something Gravity Falls understands at a structural level. The show isn't just telling one person's story. It's telling the story of a culture that creates Fords. A culture that separates intelligence from empathy in its educational system. A culture that rewards isolation as discipline and celebrates solitude as the mark of serious intellectual work. A culture that tells smart kids, from the moment they're identified as smart, that their value lies in their output rather than their presence. Ford is a cautionary tale, yes, but the caution isn't just watch out for dream demons. It's watch out for a world that makes dream demons attractive. Watch out for the loneliness that your achievements are papering over. Watch out for the moment when your identity becomes so fused with your intelligence that losing an argument feels like losing yourself. I see this in academia. I see it in tech. I see it in any field where brilliant people are celebrated for their minds and neglected as human beings. The Ford Pines pipeline is real. Kids who are identified as gifted, pulled into accelerated programs, told they're special, given the implicit message that their specialness is what earns them attention and care. These kids grow into adults who can solve differential equations but can't have a conversation about their feelings. Who can write a groundbreaking paper but can't tell their partner what they need? Who can build a portal to another dimension but can't pick up the phone and say, "I'm sorry, I miss you." And the Bills of the world are waiting for them. Not dream demons usually, but the human equivalents. The mentor who sees a vulnerable protege and takes advantage. The partner who recognizes a person's need for validation and uses it as leverage. The organization that identifies a brilliant employee and works them until they're hollow, offering praise and promotions instead of genuine care. The pattern repeats because the conditions that create it repeat. And until we change the conditions, until we create a world where gifted children are taught that their value isn't contingent on their output, the Fords will keep falling through portals of their own making. But let me not lose the thread here. Let me come back to Ford specifically, and to the philosophical framework that I think best explains his journey. There's a concept in existential philosophy called thrownness. Martin Heidegger used it to describe the condition of being born into circumstances you didn't choose. You didn't choose your body, your family, your time, your place. You were thrown into existence, and you have to make something of it. Ford was thrown into the world with 12 fingers and a genius IQ and a twin brother and a town full of broken glass. He didn't choose any of it, and his tragedy is that he spent most of his life reacting to his thrownness instead of accepting it. He fought against being different when he could have embraced it. He fought against needing people when he could have let them in. He fought against his brother when he could have fought alongside him. And the 30 years in other dimensions, that was the ultimate thrownness. Ford was thrown into alien realities with no control, no safety, no companionship, and he survived. He adapted. He endured, but he did it the only way he knew how, alone, with his walls up and his journals open and his trust locked away where no one could reach it. I want to tell you about a psychological framework called attachment theory. It was developed by a researcher named John Bowlby in the mid-20th century, and it describes how our early relationships with caregivers shape our ability to form bonds throughout our lives. Bowlby identified several attachment styles. Secure attachment, where you trust that people will be there for you. Anxious attachment, where you desperately need closeness but are terrified of rejection. And avoidant attachment, where you've learned that relying on others leads to pain, so you shut down your need for connection entirely. Ford is textbook avoidant attachment. His early experiences, the bullying, the conditional love from his father, the science fair incident, taught him that people will let you down, that the closer someone gets, the more damage they can do. And so, Ford built a life that minimized the possibility of getting hurt. He worked alone. He lived alone. He studied alone. When he did let someone in, like Fiddleford, he kept them at arm's length, sharing his work, but never his vulnerability. And then Bill came along and bypassed all of Ford's defenses by offering something that didn't feel like attachment at all. A partnership of minds. An intellectual connection, pure and clean, without the messy, dangerous warmth of human intimacy. Bill was safe, or seemed safe, because he didn't want Ford's love. He wanted Ford's brain. And Ford could give his brain freely, because his brain was the one thing he'd never been hurt for sharing. Except that wasn't true, was it? Because the science fair. Because West Coast Tech. Ford had been hurt for sharing his brain too, just not by a demon, by a brother who was afraid of losing him. Everything connects. Everything circles back. That's what makes Ford's story a tragedy in the classical sense. It's not a series of random bad events. It's a chain of cause and effect where each link is forged from the same material. Fear. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being alone. which paradoxically drives you to be more alone. There's a concept in Greek tragedy called hamartia, which is often translated as tragic flaw, but more accurately means a missing of the mark. It's not that the hero is bad, it's that the hero is aiming at the wrong target. Oedipus is aiming at the truth, but doesn't realize the truth will destroy him. Macbeth is aiming at power, but doesn't realize power will consume him. Ford is aiming at understanding. He wants to understand the anomalies, understand the universe, understand why he's different. And this aim isn't wrong. It's noble even. But Ford misses the mark because he's aiming outward when he should be aiming inward. The thing Ford most needs to understand isn't the portal or the nightmare realm or the source of Gravity Falls weirdness. It's himself. It's why he pushes people away. It's why he can't forgive his brother. It's why he trusted a demon over a friend. And here's the beautiful, painful irony. The answer was always right in front of him. In the High Six, in the Stano War, in the kid with the pine tree hat who wanted to be just like him. The answers Ford spent his whole life searching for weren't in other dimensions. They were in the dimension he left behind. I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier and dig into it, because I think it's central to understanding Ford's tragedy and why it resonates so deeply with so many people. The idea that Ford represents the cost of intelligence without connection. We live in a culture that worships intelligence. We celebrate the genius, the prodigy, the person who sees what no one else can see. Our heroes are the lone inventors, the brilliant scientists, the maverick thinkers who change the world through the sheer force of their minds. And there's nothing wrong with celebrating intelligence. But the mythology we've built around it, the mythology that says a great mind is worth any sacrifice, that genius requires solitude, that the pursuit of knowledge is more important than the pursuit of connection, that mythology is dangerous. And Ford is what it looks like when someone lives inside that mythology completely. Ford sacrificed his brother for his mind. He sacrificed McGucket for his mind. He sacrificed 30 years of his life for his mind. And when he finally got everything his mind had been working toward, when the portal was built and the answers were within reach, it turned out that his mind had been working for a demon. The very thing he valued most about himself was the thing that was being exploited. And this isn't just a cartoon problem. There are real people living Ford's story right now. People who are so identified with their intelligence that they can't form genuine connections, because genuine connections require vulnerability. And vulnerability requires admitting that you don't have all the answers. People who push away anyone who isn't on their level because they've internalized the idea that closeness with ordinary people is a form of settling. People who would rather be alone and right than together and uncertain. There's a loneliness particular to gifted people, and it's not the kind of loneliness that comes from not being around others. It's the kind that comes from being around others and feeling like you're speaking a different language. Ford felt this his entire life. The six fingers were just the visible manifestation of an invisible reality. Ford's mind worked differently, saw differently, understood differently. And the world, which rewards normal and punishes deviation, never gave him a way to be different and connected at the same time. Until Stan. Stan, who didn't understand Ford's equations, but understood Ford. Stan, who couldn't help with the portal, but could hold his brother's hand. Stan, who spent 30 years in a basement, not because he was smart enough to reopen a portal, but because he loved his brother enough to refuse to stop trying. If you're still awake, I want you to think about something. Who is your Stan? Who is the person in your life who doesn't need you to be brilliant, who doesn't need you to prove anything, who just needs you to show up? And if you can think of that person, I want you to think about whether you've been closing the blinds. Because that's the real lesson of Ford's story. Not that intelligence is bad. Not that ambition is wrong. Not that you shouldn't chase your dreams or study the universe or build impossible machines. The lesson is simpler than that, and harder than that all at once. Don't close the blinds. When someone loves you, imperfectly and clumsily, and without fully understanding what you're going through, don't close the blinds. When someone reaches for you and their hand is the wrong shape, when their help isn't the kind of help you think you need, when their love looks different from the validation you've been chasing, don't close the blinds. Because the thing on the other side of the glass might not be a demon. It might not be a portal to another dimension. It might just be your brother, standing in the driveway, waiting to see if you're going to let him back in. Let's sit with this for a while longer, because Ford's relationship with guilt is something I haven't fully explored yet, and it's one of the most complex aspects of his character. Ford carries guilt the way some people carry chronic pain. It's always there, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but never absent. And the guilt operates on multiple levels. There's the guilt about Stan. Ford knows, on some level, that the science fair wasn't Stan's fault. Or at least, not entirely Stan's fault. Stan was a scared kid who handled his fear badly, and Ford was a proud kid who handled his pain badly. And between the two of them, they created a wound that festered for decades. Ford's guilt about Stan isn't simple remorse. It's the more complicated kind, the kind that coexists with anger. Ford feels guilty for how things went, and he's furious at Stan for how things went. And the guilt and the fury feed each other in an endless cycle. Then there's the guilt about McGucket. Ford called his friend to help build a dangerous machine. Ford kept the truth about Bill a secret. Ford ignored McGucket's warnings, and McGucket lost his mind as a result. This guilt is less ambiguous than the guilt about Stan. Ford knows he was wrong. He knows he could have prevented it. But this guilt is also more distant, because Ford spent so long in other dimensions that by the time he came back, McGucket was already gone in every way that mattered. The damage was done and calcified. There was nothing left to fix, only something to mourn. And then there's the guilt about Bill. This is the deepest and most poisonous layer. Because Ford's relationship with Bill wasn't just a mistake. It was a seduction. Ford was drawn to Bill, fascinated by him, grateful to him. Before the betrayal, Ford experienced Bill as the most important relationship of his life. More important than Stan, more important than McGucket, more important than anyone. And when that relationship was revealed to be a lie, Ford didn't just feel betrayed. He felt ashamed. Ashamed that he'd been taken in. Ashamed that he'd been willing. Ashamed that some part of him, the lonely, desperate part that just wanted to be chosen, had made the manipulation possible. This is the guilt that abuse survivors carry. The "why did I let it happen" guilt. The "I should have known better" guilt. The "a smart person wouldn't have fallen for this" guilt. And it's the most destructive kind of guilt because it turns the victim into their own prosecutor. Ford doesn't just blame himself for trusting Bill. He blames himself for being the kind of person who needed to trust Bill in the first place. He blames the loneliness. He blames the neediness. He blames the soft, scared, six-fingered kid from Glass Shard Beach who just wanted someone to say he was enough. And so Ford walls that kid off. He builds layers of armor around the vulnerability that Bill exploited. He becomes harder, sharper, more paranoid. He decides that the solution to having been manipulated is to never be manipulable again, which means never being open, never being soft, never needing anyone. This is survival. It's understandable. But it's also another form of Bill's victory. Because Bill didn't just take Ford's trust. Bill took Ford's ability to trust. And a person without the ability to trust is a person who's still in the cage, even after the door has been opened. Ford's story is often compared to the myth of Icarus, and I understand why. The boy who flew too close to the sun. The genius who reached too far. But I think a better comparison is the myth of Orpheus. Orpheus, in Greek mythology, was a musician whose playing was so beautiful it could charm gods and monsters alike. When his wife Eurydice died, Orpheus descended into the underworld to bring her back, and the gods of the dead, moved by his music, agreed to release her on one condition. As he led Eurydice back to the surface, he could not look back at her. He had to trust that she was behind him, following, alive, without seeing it for himself. And Orpheus couldn't do it. At the very last moment, just as the sunlight was within reach, he turned around, and Eurydice was pulled back into the underworld forever. Ford is Orpheus. The thing he needs most, connection, love, his brother, is always right behind him. But he keeps turning around. He keeps checking. He keeps looking for proof that it's real, for evidence that he can trust it. And in the looking, in the checking, in the inability to simply believe, he loses it. The science fair. Turn around. Stan is right there, terrified and sorry. But Ford turns around with suspicion instead of compassion, and the connection is lost. The portal. Turn around. McGucket is right there, warning him, trying to save him. But Ford turns around with dismissal instead of gratitude, and the connection is lost. The return. Turn around. Stan is right there, having spent 30 years trying to save him. But Ford turns around with anger instead of wonder, and the connection is almost lost again. It's only at the very end, after Weirdmageddon, after the memory gun, after watching Stan lose everything, that Ford finally stops turning around. He finally accepts that the people behind him are real, that their love doesn't need to be verified, that trust is not a calculation, but a leap. Let me talk about something else that Ford's story makes me think about. The nature of intelligence itself. Not intelligence as a measurement, not IQ scores and academic achievements, but intelligence as an experience. What it actually feels like to be the person in the room who understands things that others don't. Because there's a loneliness to understanding. This sounds counterintuitive. You'd think that understanding more would make the world richer, more connected, more accessible. And in some ways it does. But in other ways, understanding creates distance. When you see patterns that others miss, when you grasp implications that others don't, when your mind is always running 3 steps ahead of the conversation, you start to feel like you're watching a movie that everyone else is experiencing in real time. You're always slightly apart, always slightly ahead, always slightly alone. Ford experienced this his entire life. His mind was his greatest gift and his heaviest burden. He could look at the anomalies of gravity falls and see the underlying structure, the patterns, the connections. He could build machines that shouldn't work and write journals that read like poetry. But he couldn't sit in a room with his brother and just be there without his mind pulling him toward the next question, the next mystery, the next thing that needed to be understood. There's a term in psychology for this: overexcitability. It was coined by a Polish psychologist named Kazimierz Dabrowski, and it describes the heightened intensity of experience that many gifted people share. Intellectual overexcitability, the kind Ford has, means that your mind never really turns off. You're always processing, always analyzing, always reaching for more information. And while this makes you extraordinarily capable in intellectual pursuits, it also makes it very hard to be present in ordinary moments. The moments that build relationships. The moments that build love. Ford couldn't be present with Stan because his mind was always somewhere else. Somewhere more interesting, more challenging, more worthy of his attention. And Stan, who didn't have that overexcitability, who could be fully present in a moment without his mind pulling him away, was left standing in the wake of Ford's departure over and over again. This isn't Ford's fault exactly. He didn't choose to have a mind that never rests. But it's his responsibility. And there's a difference. Fault is about blame. Responsibility is about response. Ford's mind is not his fault, but how he responds to it. Whether he uses it to connect or to isolate. Whether he shares his thoughts or hoards them. Whether he looks at the people around him or stares at the portal, that's his choice. It took Ford almost a lifetime to learn this, and watching him learn it is one of the most moving arcs in animated television. Here's what I think about when I think about Ford Pines and the cost of his story. I think about all the Fords out there. Not cartoon characters, but real people. The kid in school who's too smart for the other kids and too young for the adults and exists in this strange, lonely middle ground where no one quite fits. The graduate student who's so deep in their research that they haven't called their family in months. The scientist who's so focused on the breakthrough that they don't notice their relationships falling apart. The person who's so afraid of being ordinary that they'll sacrifice everything, even the people who love them, for the chance to be extraordinary. These people exist. You might be one of them. I might be talking to one of them right now. And if I am, I want to say this as gently as I can. Your mind is a gift. Your curiosity is beautiful. Your drive to understand the world is one of the best things about being human. But it's not the only thing. And if you're building your life around it like Ford built his, if you're using intelligence as a substitute for intimacy, if you're hiding behind equations, because equations don't reject you, if you've convinced yourself that being alone is the same as being strong, then you're building a portal. And on the other side of that portal is not the answer to all your questions. On the other side is a nightmare. And the exit is not through more brilliance, or more discovery, or more proof that you're special. The exit is through the person you've been pushing away. Ford's tragedy is a common tragedy, wearing an uncommon costume. Strip away the dimensions and the demon and the magic, and what you have is a story about a person who was afraid to be loved, who wanted to be admired instead, because admiration felt safer, who chose the company of a mind over the company of a heart, who learned, too late and at too great a cost, that a life without warmth is a life wasted, no matter how many pages of brilliant notes you leave behind. I think we should talk about forgiveness now, because Ford's story is ultimately a forgiveness story, and forgiveness is one of the hardest things human beings are asked to do. Ford has to forgive Stan for the science fair, for being careless, for being the reason, or at least the catalyst, that Ford's life went sideways. And this is hard, genuinely hard, because the wound is real. Stan did break the machine. Stan did cost Ford his dream school. The damage was not imaginary. But the meaning Ford assigned to it, that Stan did it deliberately, that Stan's carelessness was equivalent to malice, that was Ford's addition to the story. And letting go of that interpretation, rewriting the narrative from my brother, betrayed me to my brother, was scared and clumsy and human, that's the forgiveness. Stan has to forgive Ford too, for the closed blinds, for the years of silence, for calling him only when he needed something, for punching him in the face when he came through the portal, for 30 years of working to save someone who couldn't even say thank you. Stan's forgiveness is, in some ways, the easier one to give, because Stan has always been better at love than Ford. But it's not without cost. Stan has to let go of the resentment that sustained him through 3 decades of loneliness. He has to stop being the wronged party and start being a brother again. And Ford has to forgive himself. This is the hardest forgiveness of all. Ford has to forgive the kid who closed the blinds, the student who chose isolation over friendship, the researcher who summoned a demon because he was lonely, the man who ignored his friend's warnings because his ego couldn't absorb the possibility that he was wrong. Self-forgiveness requires something that Ford has always found difficult: seeing himself clearly. Not the idealized version, the brilliant mind chosen by destiny. Not the demonized version, the fool who let Bill Cipher in. The real version, the complete version. The 6-fingered kid from Glass Shard Beach who was scared and brilliant and lonely and made terrible choices and loved his brother and lost his brother and found him again. Ford has to look at all of that and say, yes, This is who I am. All of it. The genius and the fool. The hero and the villain. The person who built the portal. And the person who helped destroy Bill Cipher. I am all of these things. And none of them defines me more than any other. And I can put them down now. The Stano War. 2 is that forgiveness made manifest. It's Ford saying, I forgive you, Stan, for the machine. It's Stan saying, I forgive you, Ford, for the blinds. It's both of them saying, I forgive myself for the years we lost, and I'm not going to lose any more. I want to come back now to something I said at the very beginning of this video. I said that Ford's tragedy isn't that bad things happened to him. It's that almost every bad thing that happened to him started with a choice he made because he was afraid. And I want to amend that slightly, because the more I think about Ford, the more I realize that his tragedy isn't just about fear, it's about love. Specifically, it's about the inability to accept love in the form it's offered. Stan's love was offered in the form of loyalty. Show up, fight the bully, build the boat, wait 30 years. This is the love of someone who isn't eloquent, who can't match your intellect, who can't follow your equations, but who will be there. Rain or shine, portal or no portal, Stan will be there. Ford couldn't accept this love because it didn't look the way he expected love to look. Love, in Ford's framework, looked like admiration. It looked like someone appreciating his mind, recognizing his brilliance, choosing him for his exceptional qualities. Stan's love was unconditional, and Ford had never been taught that unconditional love was real. Philbrick's love was conditional on achievement. The world's acceptance was conditional on normalcy. Even West Coast Tech's interest was conditional on a working machine. So when Bill offered conditional love, admiration for Ford's mind, recognition of Ford's brilliance, a partnership based on Ford's exceptional qualities, Ford recognized it. It felt familiar. It felt like the only kind of love he'd ever known, just bigger and more cosmic. I choose you because you're special. Stan's love said, I choose you because you're mine. And Ford couldn't hear it. Not for decades. Not until the end, when Stan was willing to give up his own mind to save a world that Ford had endangered, and Ford finally understood. Stan's love was never about Ford's brain, or Ford's discoveries, or Ford's 6 fingers. Stan's love was about Ford. Just Ford. The whole complicated, flawed, brilliant, broken person. There's something unbearably sad about how long it takes Ford to learn this. But there's something unbearably hopeful about the fact that he learns it at all. That's the genius of Gravity Falls. It doesn't give us a story where Ford's tragedy is permanent. It doesn't leave him in the cave, in the portal, in the isolation. It brings him home. It gives him a second chance. It says, yes, you spent 40 years making the wrong choice, but here, at the end, you can make the right one. And the right choice is so simple, it almost hurts. Get on the boat. Be with your brother. Let someone love you without having to earn it. But I'm not done yet. There are more layers to this. Because Ford's story doesn't just operate on the level of personal tragedy. It also operates on the level of mythology. And I think Gravity Falls is doing something very deliberate with how it positions Ford within the larger tapestry of the show's world. Think about what Ford represents in the context of Gravity Falls itself. The town is built on weirdness, anomalies, cryptids, dimensional rifts, all of it simmering beneath the surface of an otherwise unremarkable Oregon logging town. And Ford is the person who tried to catalog that weirdness, to reduce it to data, to turn the magical into the measurable. He wanted to understand the unknowable, and in trying, he became part of it. There's something almost mythological about Ford's journey through the portal. 30 years wandering through other dimensions. It mirrors the great mythological journeys. Odysseus took 20 years to get home from Troy. Dante traveled through hell, purgatory, and paradise. The hero descends into the underworld, and, if they're lucky, comes back changed. Ford's portal exile is his underworld journey, his katabasis, to use the Greek term, the descent that must happen before the return. And like all katabasis stories, what matters isn't just the descent. It's what you bring back. Odysseus brought back wisdom and a desperate longing for home. Dante brought back a vision of divine love. What did Ford bring back? Paranoia, mostly. Fear. The certainty that the universe is hostile and that trust is a luxury he can't afford. Ford went to the underworld and came back with the wrong lesson. He came back thinking that the universe had taught him to be harder, when really it should have taught him to be softer. This is the tragedy within the tragedy. Ford survived 30 years in hostile dimensions. He's a survivor. That's remarkable. But survival, by itself, isn't growth. You can survive something and still be diminished by it. You can endure extraordinary hardship and come out the other side smaller than you were going in, because the hardship calcified you instead of refining you. Ford came back from the portal calcified. His edges were sharper. His walls were higher. His capacity for warmth had been hammered into a thin, cold sheet by 30 years of alien hostility. And the people waiting for him on this side, Stan, Dipper, Mabel, they had to find a way to soften him again. Not with force, not with logic, but with presence, with patience, with the quiet insistence of love that refuses to give up, even when the object of that love has forgotten how to receive it. Let me take a detour here. Let me talk about the show's creator, Alex Hirsch, and what he was doing with Ford's character. Because understanding the creative intent helps illuminate the emotional architecture of the story. Hirsch based Gravity Falls on his own childhood. He and his twin sister Ariel spent summers with their great-aunt Lois in a cabin in the woods. Dipper is based on Hirsch himself, curious and anxious and always looking for mysteries. Mabel is based on Ariel, exuberant and creative and wearing ridiculous sweaters. And Grunkle Stan is based on Hirsch's grandfather, a storyteller and joker who loved messing with people. Ford is harder to trace to a single inspiration, but I think Ford represents something broader than a specific person. Ford represents the fear that every smart kid carries somewhere inside them. The fear that their intelligence is the only thing keeping them afloat. That without it, they'd drown. That the world would look at them and see nothing worth loving. Hirsch has talked in interviews about wanting Gravity Falls to be a show about the complexity of family. Not the sitcom version of Family, where problems are resolved in 22 minutes and everyone hugs at the end. The real version, where people who love each other still hurt each other, where grudges last decades, where forgiveness is a process and not an event. Ford and Stan's relationship is the beating heart of that vision. Two people who love each other deeply and have spent most of their lives unable to express it. Two people whose flaws interlock like gears, each one driving the other in a direction they don't want to go. Stan's carelessness drives Ford toward isolation. Ford's isolation drives Stan toward desperation. And around they go, caught in a machine of their own making. There's something Hirsch said in an interview that I think is particularly illuminating. He said that he wanted the show to earn its emotional moments, that he didn't want to tell the audience what to feel. He wanted to build the structure, layer by layer, episode by episode, so that when the big moments hit, they'd hit with the weight of everything that came before. And that's exactly what happens with Ford's story. When Stan sacrifices his memory in Weirdmageddon, that moment only works because you've spent 2 seasons understanding what memory means to these characters, what identity means, what family means. The sacrifice isn't just dramatic, it's specific, it's earned. It's the culmination of a decades-long story about 2 brothers who couldn't find their way back to each other. J.K. Simmons, who voices Ford, brings an incredible depth to the character. Simmons is one of those actors who can convey entire emotional landscapes with small vocal shifts. He played Ford with a kind of controlled intensity, a voice that's always slightly too tight, always slightly too careful, as if Ford is permanently bracing for the next blow. There's a guardedness in Simmons' performance that perfectly captures Ford's psychological state. This is a man who has learned, through decades of pain, that the world will take anything you leave unprotected. But Simmons also lets moments of warmth slip through. When Ford talks to Dipper about his journals, when he shares his discoveries, there's a softening in his voice that tells you the kid from Glass Shard Beach is still in there, still excited, still eager to show someone what he's found. The tragedy is in the gap between those moments of warmth and the walls that surround them. I want to talk about something specific now. I want to talk about the moment in The Last Mabelcorn when Ford shows Dipper the room where he keeps all his research on Bill Cipher. This is one of the most visually and emotionally loaded scenes in the entire series. The room is covered in Bill Cipher imagery, notes, drawings, diagrams, equations. It looks like a shrine. It looks like obsession. And from Dipper's perspective, from the outside looking in, it looks like Ford might still be working with Bill. Like maybe Ford isn't the hero Dipper thought he was. Like maybe the smartest person Dipper has ever met is actually serving the most dangerous entity in the multiverse. But what the room actually represents is something more complicated and more sad. It represents Ford's attempt to understand what happened to him, to catalog the manipulation, to trace the chain of events, to figure out where he went wrong. It's not a shrine to Bill. It's a crime board. Ford is trying to solve the crime that was committed against his own mind. And this is such a deeply human response to abuse. The need to understand. The compulsive review of events. Searching for the moment you could have done something different. The warning sign you should have caught. The word or gesture that should have told you the truth. Abuse survivors often describe this kind of obsessive reconstruction, going over and over the timeline, trying to find the point where it all went wrong, as if identifying that point could somehow undo the damage. Ford can't undo the damage, but he can't stop looking for the point either. And so his study becomes a monument to his own manipulation, a room-sized diagram of the worst mistake he ever made, and he visits it the way some people visit graves. Not to move on, to remember. When Ford tells Dipper the truth about Bill in that scene, it's more than an exposition dump. It's a confession. Ford is sitting across from a child who admires him, who sees him as a hero, and he's saying, "I'm not what you think I am. I was fooled. I was used. The great mind that you admire was outsmarted by a triangle with a top hat, and I didn't figure it out in time, and people got hurt because of me." This is vulnerability. Real vulnerability. The kind that Ford has avoided for decades. And it's significant that he offers it to Dipper and not to Stan. Because Dipper's admiration feels safer than Stan's love. If Dipper is disappointed, it hurts, but it's a contained hurt. If Stan sees the full picture of Ford's failure, it hits a much deeper wound. It confirms everything Ford has always feared, that Stan was the better person all along, that the golden child was actually the fool. And isn't that the deepest fear of every gifted child? Not that they'll fail, exactly, but that their failure will prove what the bullies always said, that they're not special, that the intelligence was a costume, and underneath it is just another scared kid who doesn't know what they're doing. Ford's entire life has been a performance of competence. Look at my journals. Look at my discoveries. Look at my portal. Look at my grant. Look at my doctorate, completed 3 years early. Look at all of this evidence that I know what I'm doing, that I'm in control, that I'm the person you should be paying attention to. And Bill Cipher walked through that performance like it was tissue paper and took everything. That's humiliating, in the most literal sense. It humbles. It brings you down to the ground. And Ford, who has always needed to be above, to be elevated, to be exceptional, can't absorb the humiliation without feeling like his entire identity is dissolving. There's a concept in psychology called narcissistic injury. It doesn't mean that the person is a narcissist in the clinical sense. It means that a person whose self-worth is heavily invested in a particular self-image experiences a devastating blow to that image. The bigger the investment, the bigger the injury. And Ford's investment in being the smartest, the most brilliant, the most exceptional was absolute. So the injury of Bill's manipulation was absolute too. This is why Ford can't forgive Stan. Not because the science fair was that important, but because forgiving Stan would require Ford to examine his own role in the tragedy. It would require him to see that his reaction to the broken machine, the closed blinds, the decades of silence, was disproportionate. And if Ford's reaction was disproportionate, then Ford was wrong. And if Ford was wrong about that, maybe he was wrong about other things too. Maybe the journals aren't as important as he thought. Maybe the portal wasn't worth building. Maybe Bill chose him not because he was exceptional, but because he was vulnerable. The thread of wrongness pulls at everything. One admission leads to another, which leads to another, until the entire tapestry of Ford's self-image is in danger of unraveling. And so Ford holds the thread in place. He maintains the story. He stays angry at Stan because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. Until Weirdmageddon. Until the memory gun. Until the moment when Ford has to watch his brother's identity dissolve because of a chain of events that Ford started. That's the moment when holding the thread becomes impossible. That's the moment when the tapestry unravels, and Ford has to see what's underneath. What's underneath is love. Not complicated love, not conditional love, not the transactional love of Philbrick's household or Bill's deal. Simple love. Stan's love. The kind that doesn't keep score, doesn't require repayment, doesn't even require understanding. The kind that spends 30 years in a basement rebuilding a portal because that's what brothers do. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. This video is long, really long. And if you've been with me this whole time, whether you're awake or asleep or somewhere in between, I appreciate you. This is the kind of story that deserves to be told slowly, because it was built slowly. Layer by layer, episode by episode, over 2 seasons, and 20 years of fictional time, and 40 years of backstory. Rushing through it would be doing it a disservice. And if you're enjoying this, subscribing is the easiest way to help. It's completely free, and it tells us that these long, deep dives into the stories we love are worth making. So let me keep going. Because there's one more dimension to Ford's story that I haven't explored, and it might be the most important one. Ford as a father figure. Ford doesn't have children. He never married. His 30 years in other dimensions foreclosed any possibility of a conventional family life. And yet, in the 2nd season of Gravity Falls, he becomes, briefly and imperfectly, a father figure to Dipper. And this matters because it reveals something about Ford that even Ford might not realize. The apprenticeship he offers Dipper isn't just about passing on knowledge. It's about having a second chance. Ford sees in Dipper the kid he used to be. The curious, anxious, brilliant kid who just wants someone to take his questions seriously. And Ford wants to be for Dipper what no one was for him. He wants to be the mentor, the guide, the person who says your curiosity isn't a burden, it's a superpower. Here, let me show you how to use it. This is beautiful. And it's also dangerous. Because Ford's mentorship of Dipper carries all of Ford's baggage. His need for validation. His tendency to prioritize intellect over emotion. His unconscious desire to create someone who can continue his work, who can justify his life's choices by following the same path. Ford doesn't want Dipper to become Dipper. He wants Dipper to become a better version of Ford. And this is what separates good mentorship from projection. A good mentor helps you become more yourself. A projecting mentor helps you become more like them. Ford, for all his good intentions, is projecting. He's offering Dipper the life that Ford chose, the life of solitary intellectual pursuit, as if it's the highest possible aspiration. And Dipper, who is 12 and impressionable and desperate for the approval of someone who understands his mind, is inclined to accept. But Mabel pulls him back, and Stan, quietly, lets him go. And Dipper, in the end, makes the choice that Ford couldn't make at the same age. He chooses his twin. Think about what this means for Ford. He offered Dipper his life, his passion, his legacy. And Dipper looked at it and said, "No thank you. I'd rather go home with my sister." This isn't a rejection of Ford. Dipper still loves Ford. He still admires Ford. But it's a reordering of priorities that Ford was incapable of at the same age. Dipper is saying that family comes first, that connection comes first, that no amount of intellectual adventure is worth the loss of the person who knows you best. And Ford, watching this happen, is forced to reckon with the ghost of his own 12-year-old self. The version of Ford who could have said the same thing to Stan, who could have looked at West Coast Tech and the perpetual motion machine and the whole glittering future of academic achievement and said, "Actually, I'd rather stay and build a boat with my brother." That Ford didn't exist. But Dipper does. And Dipper's choice is both a vindication and an indictment. It says, this was always possible. You could have chosen differently. The path you took was not the only path. And Ford has to live with that. Not as punishment, but as knowledge. The knowledge that the thing he sacrificed, his brother, his family, his capacity for simple human closeness, was never a necessary sacrifice. It was a choice. His choice. Made out of fear and pride and the desperate need to be exceptional. This is one of the reasons I think Ford's story resonates so deeply with adults who watch Gravity Falls. Because most of us, by the time we reach adulthood, have made at least one choice that we know was wrong. One moment where we chose the ambitious thing over the loving thing, the impressive thing over the kind thing, the future over the present. And Ford's story holds up a mirror and says, yes, you did that, and it cost you something. But it's not too late. The boat is still on the beach. Let me talk about mirrors for a moment, because Ford's story is full of them. Ford and Stan are mirrors of each other. They're twins, genetically identical, born 15 minutes apart. But the lives they lived couldn't be more different. Ford went to college, got a grant, built a laboratory, made contact with an interdimensional being. Stan was thrown out of his house, lived in his car, ran scams, got arrested, and spent 30 years in a basement. And yet, at the end of everything, they end up in the same place, on a boat, together. The mirroring is deliberate. Hirsch constructed these characters as two halves of a whole. Ford has the intelligence, but lacks the emotional wisdom. Stan has the emotional wisdom, but lacks the education. Ford can build a portal, but can't have a conversation. Stan can't build a portal, but can maintain a relationship across 30 years of separation. They need each other. They've always needed each other. And the tragedy of their story is that it took them so long to realize it. Ford and Bill are also mirrors. Both of them are brilliant. Both of them are charismatic. Both of them are fundamentally alone. Bill's dimension was dying, and he needed to escape. Ford's emotional world was dying, and he needed someone to validate it. They found each other not by accident, but by affinity. Like calling to like. Two lonely geniuses, reaching across dimensions for something they couldn't find in their own worlds. The difference, of course, is that Bill is a sociopath. Bill doesn't feel loneliness the way Ford does. Bill's charm is a tool, not an expression of genuine warmth. When Bill says he chose Ford, he's not expressing admiration. He's expressing selection, the way a predator selects prey. But from Ford's perspective, inside the experience of it, the distinction was invisible. Bill felt like a friend. Bill felt like the first person who truly understood Ford's mind. And when you've been lonely your entire life, when you've been the strange kid with the weird hands and the too big brain, the experience of being understood is so overwhelming, so intoxicating, that you don't ask questions. You don't look for the seams. You just hold on. Ford and Dipper are mirrors too, but in a more hopeful direction. Dipper has Ford's curiosity without Ford's isolation. Dipper has Ford's intensity without Ford's rigidity. And most importantly, Dipper has something Ford never had: a twin who refuses to be left behind. Mabel won't let Dipper become Ford. She won't let him disappear into his head. She grabs him, pulls him back, makes him participate in the messy, wonderful, ordinary business of being human. She throws glitter on his research. She makes him go to parties when he'd rather read. She annoys him and loves him and won't let go. And Dipper, for all his moments of wanting to escape into Ford's world, for all his temptation to choose the extraordinary over the ordinary, ultimately holds on to Mabel. He chooses the glitter. He chooses the parties. He chooses the mess. This is the mirror that matters most, because it shows Ford what his life could have looked like if he'd had a Mabel. Or rather, if he'd let Stan be his Mabel. If he'd let Stan pull him back from the edge, throw metaphorical glitter on his metaphorical research, refuse to be left behind. Stan tried. Stan was always trying. But Ford wouldn't let him in. And you can't save someone who won't open the door. There's a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas who wrote about the face of the other. Levinas believed that the most fundamental ethical experience is the encounter with another person's face. When you truly look at someone, when you see them as a complete being with their own suffering and their own needs, you are called into responsibility. You can't unsee them. You can't unfeel the obligation to respond to their existence. Ford spent most of his life avoiding faces. He looked at equations instead, at journal pages, at portal schematics, at the vast, impersonal beauty of interdimensional physics. These things don't have faces. They don't call you into responsibility. They don't need anything from you except your mind. Stan's face is the one Ford has been avoiding the longest, because Stan's face says, I need you, not your brain, not your discoveries, not your exceptional qualities. You. And responding to that need requires Ford to be present in a way that his mind has always resisted. It requires him to stop solving and start being, to stop understanding and start feeling. The moment Ford finally sees Stan's face, truly sees it, is the moment after the memory gun. When Stan is sitting in the wreckage of the Mystery Shack, blank and empty, and Ford looks at him and sees not a brother who wronged him, not a rival, not a burden, but a person. A person who gave everything. A person whose face is asking, without words, without memory, without even knowing who Ford is, for love. That's when Ford breaks open. Not dramatically, not with speeches or grand gestures, but quietly, in the way that real emotional breakthroughs happen. A crack in the wall, a sliver of light. And through that crack, 30 years of loneliness and paranoia and self-hatred start to drain away, replaced by something Ford has been running from his entire life. Connection. Just connection. Simple, unglamorous, unexceptional connection. Two people in a room. Two faces looking at each other. One saying, I'm here. The other saying, I see you. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's what Ford spent 40 years and multiple dimensions searching for, and it was in Glass Shard Beach the entire time. It was in a handshake that required 6 fingers. It was in a boat that never sailed. It was in a brother who never stopped waiting. There's a Japanese concept called kintsugi. It's the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, you fill them with something precious. The broken thing becomes more beautiful than it was before the breaking, because the gold traces of repair tell a story. They say, this was shattered, and someone loved it enough to put it back together. And the putting back together is itself a kind of art. Ford and Stan's relationship is kintsugi. It was shattered, completely, devastatingly shattered. And the repair, the slow and painful process of forgiveness and understanding and acceptance, has filled the cracks with gold. The Stano War, too, is a golden vessel in this sense. Not literally, though Bill did turn Ford to gold in a horrible parody of this very idea, but metaphorically. The boat is the proof that the breaking wasn't the end, that the pieces can be gathered, that love is the gold that fills the cracks. I want to slow down now. I want to let the pace drop a little, because we're approaching the end of this journey, and I want you to feel the weight of what we've covered. We started in Glass Shard Beach. 2 kids on a broken beach, finding a broken boat, dreaming of a future they couldn't see clearly, but could feel in their bones. A future of adventure, and freedom, and togetherness, 'tis. A future where being different didn't matter, because they had each other. We moved through the science fair, the closed blinds, the exile of Stan. We watched Ford climb the ladder of academic achievement, rung by rung, each step taking him further from the ground where his brother stood. We watched him find Gravity Falls, catalog its wonders, fill journals with meticulous drawings of impossible things. We watched him reach the end of his knowledge and hunger for more. We watched him open a door that should have stayed closed. We watched Bill Cipher walk through that door with a smile and a handshake and a lie so beautiful that Ford couldn't recognize it as a lie. We watched the portal go up, the friendship go down, McGucket's mind dissolve into nothing. We watched Ford realize, too late, what he had built and who he had built it for. We watched him fall through the portal. 30 years in the dark. 30 years of alien skies and hostile landscapes, and the slow grinding erosion of everything soft inside him. 30 years of survival that looked like life, but wasn't. We watched him come home to a brother he couldn't forgive, and a family he didn't know how to love. We watched him project his fears onto a 12-year-old boy and nearly repeat the cycle. We watched Bill come back, bigger and worse and more terrible than before. And we watched Stan erase himself to save the world. We watched Ford witness that erasure and finally, understand what he'd been missing, what he'd been running from, what he'd been searching for in every dimension except the one that mattered. And now, the boat sails. 2 old men, broken and repaired, their cracks filled with gold. The ocean that they dreamed about as children, finally beneath them. Not because they earned it through brilliance or discovery or exceptional achievement, but because they chose each other. After everything, despite everything, because of everything. That's the tragedy of Stanford Pines. And that's the redemption of Stanford Pines. They're the same story, told from different angles. The tragedy says, look at what was lost. The redemption says, look at what was found. And both of them are true. I think that's what I want to leave you with tonight. As you're lying there, maybe half asleep, maybe turning these ideas over in your mind. Ford's story is a tragedy, yes, but it's also a love story. A strange, broken, 40 years in the making love story between 2 brothers who were supposed to sail the world together and took the longest possible detour. The boat eventually sailed. The dream didn't die. It just took a lifetime of mistakes and forgiveness to get there. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the lesson. Not that you have to do everything right, or that one wrong turn means you're lost forever, but that the boat is still on the beach. No matter how long you've been gone, no matter what dimensions you've traveled through, no matter what demons you've let into your head, the boat is still on the beach, and the person you were supposed to sail with is still waiting. If you've made it this far, thank you. If you're asleep, well, I hope the dreams are good. I hope they're about boats and brothers and handshakes that need 6 fingers instead of 5. This has been Pine Hat. Thank you, as always, for being here, for subscribing, for being part of this community that we're building together. It means more than you know. And if there's someone you haven't called in a while, someone whose love you've been too proud, or too scared, or too busy to accept, maybe tomorrow would be a good day to pick up the phone. You don't have to say anything profound. You don't have to explain the portal or the demon or the 30 years. You just have to say hi. You just have to open the blinds. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. And remember, don't close the blinds.